welcome to the 18th meeting of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2025. The first agenda item this morning is a decision to take item 4 on the agenda in private. Is the committee agreed? Thank you. Our next item is to take evidence from Ofcom in relation to its scrutiny of the BBC. We are joined in the room by Christina Nicolotti-Squires, Group Director Broadcasting and Media, and Glenn Preston, Scotland Director of Ofcom. Welcome to you both. Can I invite Mr Preston to make a short opening statement before moving to questions from the members?
Today. Just a bit of quick background on Ofcom in case people aren't familiar with us. We're the UK communications regulator, so independent of governments and the companies we regulate, with duties set out in statute. You will probably know we have a wide remit. It covers fixed line telecoms, mobile services, post-spectrum, and recently we became the UK's online safety regulator. But I think today you will be primarily interested in our work across the TV, radio and video on-demand sectors and how it relates to Scotland's creative industries in particular. Worth saying we've grown our presence in Scotland significantly in recent years. So we had about 24 people in 2017, which I highlighted during a previous appearance in front of this committee. We've got well over 100 today, based out of our office in Quartermile in Edinburgh, and that covers colleagues who work right across all of Ofcom's remit, including about 13, I think, colleagues in Christina's broadcasting and media group. The UK's model of public service broadcasting is admired across the world, with its blend of publicly funded BBC, publicly owned Channel 4 and commercially operated services such as STV and ITV, delivering well for UK audiences, while being the bedrock behind the UK's production community. However, although they continue to serve audiences well, the UK broadcasting sector is in the midst of major change, driven by global trends and changing consumer habits. To put this into context, the PSBs spent £2.7 billion on first-run UK-originated content in 2023, with Netflix expecting to have spent £13.5 billion globally in 2024, while YouTube's expected to spend closer to £15 billion. When you combine that with viewing habits that see those aged between 16 to 24 spend less than a fifth of their viewing time with traditional broadcasters, it gives a sense of the scale of the challenge our broadcasting sector faces. And if we put this in a Scottish context, there has been a positive story of growth in Scotland's TV sector in recent years, with spend on external productions here nearly doubling from 2010, where it was 119 million, to 2022, where it was 225 million, with companies both locally and globally viewing Scotland as a place where they can make high-quality programmes across a range of genres. Indeed, today sees the launch of Department Q from Netflix, a multi-million-pound production filmed here in Edinburgh, and we do wish that great success. And indeed, while inward investment is to be welcomed as part of a mixed production ecology, the role that the global streamers and tech companies now play in bringing news and entertainment to the public means there is a vital need to ensure we have a level playing field for our public service broadcasters. To that end, the UK Media Act saw the biggest change to the public service media framework in 2 decades, and our ongoing implementation of the Act will secure, among other things, appropriate prominence for public service players like the STV player on smart TVs to better enable them to compete. In addition, Ofcom's upcoming review of public service media will have financial sustainability at its heart, while we continue to ensure that our wider regulatory framework continues to support growth and creativity for the benefit of audiences, broadcasters and the wider production sector across Scotland. Camina, can I just close also by making a kind of public congratulations to MG Alapa. I think the committee will probably be aware that last week it won a couple of awards, including the kind of overall genre awards at the Prix Circom, which was an amazing achievement by them, with investment from MG Alapa, Screen Scotland and others. That was fantastic to see. I'll stop there and look forward to hearing the committee's thoughts on our work over the course of the session.
Thank you very much for those opening remarks. Ofcom does contribute to the Charter renewal process, in which areas do you think the BBC, and specifically BBC Scotland, could enhance what it does for consumers, but also for those who produce content in Scotland?
Ofcom's role in Charter renewal is more of an advisory one. At the end of the day, it's an agreement taken with the government and the BBC themselves. I think we are sort of very keen to ensure that the BBC continues to invest in productions here. We welcome the news they made last week, I think it was, about increasing production spend here and making sure that that continues. The Scottish production sector is actually a really important part of the creative economy that's doing really well across the UK, and bringing companies like, there was a premiere last night, I think, of Department Q, which the trailer looked fantastic, actually. So we're really keen to make sure that the BBC, as part of its public purpose in the existing charter, continues to deliver great content for audiences right across the UK, whoever they are. I think we've noted on occasion that the BBC needs to work perhaps a bit harder on making sure that it makes content that appeals right across different age groups. We know that they struggle with younger viewers, and there have been some challenges with sort of connection with the BBC with lower socio-economic groups. But we will just be part of that process, and any final decision, of course, will be made between the government and the BBC themselves.
Thank you. Can I ask how you view balancing that commercial and financial viability aspect alongside what public sector broadcasting can do that commercial operators wouldn't normally be making?
I think it's important to note that the public service broadcasting, and I include obviously STV, the BBC in that, Channel 4, they're a really important part of that creative economy, and without that investment and risk-taking and creating new genres of programmes, people don't leave film school and suddenly become able to direct a Hollywood movie. So there's a real talent base that's been grown in this country, which is bringing in great revenue. But it's challenging. The financial models, advertising-funded advertising and broadcasting has gone down tremendously. Audiences are fragmenting. And that's a real challenge to the industry. So we're trying to make sure that we're balancing financial sustainability with still providing great content that audiences want and reflects their lives. And it's really important, I think, particularly in the case of news as well. News has never been something that made money, but again, it's really important for democracy and for local people to feel connected.
Thank you. I'm going to move to questions from members, and I'll go to Mr Stuart Rush.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. The BBC have described current Ofcom quotas as complex, and they acknowledge that there is the possibility of a project to qualify as Scottish, only having a production office here or having a location here. So how can Ofcom ensure that commissioning of BBC and Channel 4 against the Scottish quota delivers unambiguous economic and creative growth from within Scotland across the next decade?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Stewart. So we saw the BBC announcement last week that you're referring to, where the Nations Director was talking about a change in approach, I guess, particularly on the issue of substantive base that you've mentioned, so where a production company is HQ'd, and we welcome it. We welcome that decision by the BBC. The focus of that announcement is about making sure that the BBC in the future are, I think in most cases, they do recognise that this is quite a complex area, and there may be times where it needs to be a bit nuanced, but in most cases they're looking to meet at least a couple of the criteria. And that they're what they want to achieve here is the money kind of spent in Scotland staying in Scotland, which I think is the kind of overall aim, and it's the sort of thing that Screen Scotland, for example, have been calling for. So we do welcome that. On the kind of complexity point, I think I would make no bones about it. It's it's a piece of guidance that is complex. I think that's right. But the reason it's drawn up that way, is because it's quite a complex sector, and things like funding arrangements are very, very complex, and there is a lot of nuance in it. So what we try to do is create guidance that is as flexible as possible, that responds to the complexity of the sector, and really does encourage people to invest in Scotland and make things in Scotland, but also allows things like Scottish companies to go to other bits of the UK to invest as well, and still be able to qualify as a Scottish production.
I would just add that the sector is facing real headwinds from the global platforms, from the streamers, etc. The cost of production has gone up. We're very keen to make sure that our regulatory powers are proportionate, but also are able to help companies be as flexible and innovative as they can, whilst making sure that the local economy is benefiting.
And, you know, the BBC's changes in approach for commissioning for Scotland, and that's also for Wales and Northern Ireland, confirms that, or does it confirm that the BBC haven't always played with a straight bat when it comes to this process, and that the corporation has failed to act in accordance with the spirit of Ofcom's rules?
I think that I'm going to answer for the BBC. I think you're hearing evidence from them later on this afternoon or this morning. I think that the BBC in Scotland is still very valued by people. Our own research shows that something like 83% of adults use it every day or across the week. Actually, in terms of the criteria that we set, the BBC have actually they're meant to spend 8% in Scotland. They've actually spent 9% of their spend. So I think they have been doing what they want to, but I really welcome the fact that they're extending their sort of determination to spend more money locally.
Can I just maybe add one additional point to that, which is, so our Made Out of London register, which is kind of what you're referring to in the question, I think, Mr. Stewart, there's last year, there was over 700 returns, and the BBC normally makes up about 50 or just over 50% of those returns. And that's been true over the last few years, actually. And these are just about individual titles. It's not going into kind of hours and spend and that type of thing. But it is worth saying that I think it's nearly 90% of the returns that the BBC make, of that half, do actually meet at least 2, if not 3, of the criteria. So we do have to kind of understand that the nature of this conversation is about probably a fairly small number of productions that you're talking about where they qualify only on the grounds of substantive base. So I think that's important context that we do need to be clear about.
And finally, the production costs and the production quotas for the BBC and Channel 4 are going to go through changes with the Media Act. That will have an impact on how you manage. So how are Ofcom going to ensure that the PSB continues to work with producers in Scotland under the new regime?
We are very, very committed to making sure that they deliver on what they're supposed to do. We do annual reports on both Channel 4's performance and the BBC's performance, and where we see, if we see, they're not adhering to what they do, then we do call it out. As Glenn said, we've got a lot of people based here who spend a lot of time talking to local production companies and having their ear to the ground. So we kind of know what's going on even before sort of official investigations. But we are very, we are in the midst, as you know, of implementing the Media Act, and we'll be holding everyone to account.
Can I add, Mr. Stewart, on Channel 4 in particular, so part of Ofcom's governance is that we have, and you may be aware of this, a statutory advisory committee for each of the nations of the UK, including Scotland. And our advisory committee for Scotland went to see Channel 4 just towards the tail end of last year. So they toured around different parts of the UK, meeting industry and other organisations interested in kind of Ofcom's regulatory duties. And the purpose of the committee is to give us advice on the sorts of regulatory considerations that we will have to make, including how things like in-house production are going to be working. So they have spent time with Channel 4, talked to Channel 4 about what they're thinking about in this space. It's still early days, I think it's fair to say, so I don't think we're yet clear about how this is all going to pan out. But we do have kind of ears and eyes on the ground here that are engaging directly with the industry, but also with the likes of the production sector to make sure we're listening to what it is they are both excited about and the things that they think could be challenging.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mr. Adam?
Good morning, everyone. I want to ask about your radio remit, because it's one of the things I've had an interest. I think you're aware I've had an interest in the past on it as well. Old-fashioned. I still listen to the radio, and I believe in the Queen song, Radio Gaga. It's always there for you to actually listen to. But one of my biggest concerns is the fact that since about 2018, there's been a systematically loss of the Scottish voice in radio in Scotland, and basically there's been the guidelines between programming sharing and between the regions. There's reduced local content, and that's given some of the big broadcasters the opportunity to become very London-centric and network it all. Now, the Media Act in 2024 doesn't help Ofcom, because it effectively makes you even more toothless in this situation. So how can Ofcom justify its role as a public service regulator when it's systematically allowed the collapse of local radio in Scotland through deregulation and consolidation? So my question is, what is the point of you? What is the point of Ofcom?
It's a fairly existential question. I mean, I don't recognise that kind of characterisation as toothless. I really don't think that's the case. But you're.
Because having kept an eye on this, I've not seen any enforcement of regulation as station after station has networked more and more work. And okay, now you don't have the powers, but you did in the past, and it made no difference.
Well, and you recognise the fact that the UK Parliament has passed an act that's essentially about deregulation, and you're right that those things that we used to have to require of commercial radio in particular, for example, is about deregulation.
Didn't do it in 2018.
We didn't do.
You didn't do it because effectively there was a change where it was localness was moved in 2018. So
well, that was on the basis that deregulation was coming and was already being proposed. Look, I mean, local commercial radio in Scotland is thriving. It's got a bigger reach than it does in England or Wales, and commercial radio is proving to be incredibly sustainable and strong. The most listened to radio station in the Central Belt and North of Scotland are Clyde One, MFR. And I mean, I recognise the point you make about those stations doing more kind of networking, but Global, for example, returned to a full-time Scottish schedule in 2023 immediately after that, because Global, audiences had stopped listening to
Heart and with Capital, and then a few years later they came back, had a meeting with me and said, "You were right, George. We lost our audience, it tanked." But the whole point is, the crux of my question is, broadcasters who shut down local radio in Scotland tomorrow and nothing could be done for it. Ofcom, you couldn't do anything about it. They could effectively network. Currently, at this moment, the breakfast show on what was formerly Clyde 2, Forth 2, is the only Scottish content that will be in what is now called Greatest Hits Radio. It's the only, yes, we get radio, we get news all the time, but it's the only Scottish-based show, and it's based in Glasgow. The Murray Firth, MFR, Forth 2, they've all lost their breakfast show as well. So you've lost that local voice throughout the country. And, I'm trying to get at, as you as a regulator, when you had the power, why didn't you make any inroads to try and stop this? You just said deregulation was happening. You shouldn't have accepted that.
I think at the end of the day, I wasn't around at that period of time, but I think at the end of the day, as a regulator, we only have the powers that are given to us by governments. And so if we don't, at the moment, yes, there is no requirement for them to produce the same kinds of locally created shows that they used to. However, in the Media Act, it does, and I'm, as a former journalist, I'm particularly passionate about this. There is a requirement for them to be providing locally gathered news content, which I think is really important, and we are beginning our consultations on that. And again, as I said, from my own personal point of view, I think that's really important, because I think local radio is really important to local democracy. But as I said, in terms of what is in the Act and how it's been construed, Ofcom obviously made representations, but at the end of the day, the law was decided by governments, and we can only enforce with the powers that we have.
The 2024 Media Act, really, what powers do you currently have on the back of the 2024 Act to
we're drawing up the consultation
Scottish output in local radio?
Well, we are, as I said, the deregulation doesn't require the radio stations to have the same kind of formats as they had before, but there is a requirement for them to be providing locally gathered news for their audiences. We're in the process of drawing up the consultation on that. How do you define locally gathered news, the appropriate amount of locally gathered news? We'll be putting out the consultation on that beginning of next year. We'll take responses from everybody on that. I'm sure there'll be plenty of them, and then we'll have to draw up some guidance and then enact some powers.
Can you understand how culturally in Scotland, like Wilfred, I think Radio Clyde was the first commercial station out with London in 1970, I think it was, and effectively that created a whole generation of broadcasters and talent who probably wouldn't have had that career and that opportunity. Now, if you're a young person trying to get into broadcast, and radio was often used as that way, that's not going to happen in Scotland anymore. It's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for someone to do that.
I think it's important, though, also audiences are evolving and formats are evolving. And for a lot of people these days, as well as they will still listen to some live radio, but they're consuming podcasts. And I do know, I think it was last week, STV announced they're launching a radio station. Now, if there isn't a thriving radio sector in Scotland, they wouldn't be doing that. I think I don't know much about their exact plans at the moment, but I know they're planning to do live broadcasting as well as podcasts. So that's and STV is obviously a big company with a lot of possibilities.
I'm extremely interested in that because that proves that there is a market for it, and they're doing it from an advertising point of view, because their chief executive came out and said we can advertise throughout the day. Mornings are very good for our advertisers, and then we can take them into television in the evening. But that's not what we're hearing from local radio stations as they network more and more and more. They're saying they can't sustain that. And that's the argument. Why would a major player like STV say that is doable, yet we're getting a completely different story? And you as a regulator, what have you done to be able to actually... You're part of the reason why we don't have Scottish Voices on Scottish radio at the moment.
I would say that's a government reason rather than a regulator's reason. But
well, 2018 you had the power, or you weren't here, but there was the powers there and you didn't use them.
Well, I mean, at the time, certainly around 2017, 2018, when deregulation was first on the table, there were still requirements on radio to deliver to their licensed formats. But we did
enforce them, and I can provide committee evidence if you like. I don't have it to hand, but I know that we do enforce against local radio and have done in the past. So it may not have been enforced necessarily.
Can you tell me one time in Scotland where there has been an enforcement?
Off the top of my head, I can't, but I can make sure the committee...
I didn't hear the question.
One time in Scotland where you've enforced the powers that you have and said to a broadcaster, you can't do that or you must do this?
I don't have a specific example, but I think we've certainly had... I know that we've had conversations about whether or not stations are meeting the format, their licensed formats, over the last few years, so I'm happy to come back to you on the specifics of something.
To see that. And finally, I would just like to ask, for me, this shows an example of why maybe broadcasting should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. And would you not agree with me that if that was the case and the regulator had a more Scottish-focused voice and was actually reporting to this place as opposed to Westminster, would that not be better for the Scottish broadcasting landscape?
I think there's a couple of points in there. So one Ofcom is required now post 2016 Scotland Act. We are legally obligated to be accountable to Holyrood, just as we are to all the legislatures in the UK. I would say also that we are, our governance has kind of nation's interest baked into it. So the Scottish ministers appoint a member of the Ofcom board, for example. We have a content board that looks at all our broadcasting and media issues that has a Scotland member. So we've just announced Peter McMahon, who will be known to many of you, as a member of our content board that's bringing that advice into the organisation already. And I mentioned in my answer to Mr Stewart's question, our advisory committee, where we've had some broadcasting expertise giving us advice about development of our kind of policy and regulatory
interventions. But what I'm trying to say, if we're looking at a Scottish context and Scottish media and looking for Scottish voices in it, would it not empower you as a regulator if you were able to report to this place in a Scottish context with the devolution of broadcasting?
That question, you'd expect me to say this because we're an impartial independent regulator. It's not for Ofcom. It's up to the governments and parliaments to tell us
how
they want to do it.
Yes, I'm taking the politics out of it because you'll probably find there's those here who would agree with me that don't agree with me on my end game with what Scotland should do in the future. But they'll agree with me with this idea that we're not looking through this through a Scottish prism. So from that perspective, I'm not trying to make political headway here. I'm just trying to say what I believe should be the way forward and is best for Scottish broadcasting.
I mean, on the Scottish prism point, I hope I've demonstrated that we do actually have that type of representation already in Ofcom and that we are accountable to this place. On the question of devolution, that's not something that we're going to be able to offer a view on. If governments and parliaments decide that's something that they want to do, then it would be our duty to deal
Glenn,
with
you've made a fist of it, but I'm not convinced. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Mr Adam, can I bring in Mr Kerr, please?
Well, George Adam is not a fan of regulators in general, I think, and I'm afraid I join him in that because I think Parliament, Westminster, does give regulators powers, but I'm unconvinced that regulators actually use their powers, and I think he has made a very strong case for that in connection with what's happening in Scotland in terms of radio broadcasting. Because at the end of the day, the reason that we have a regulator is to make sure that the marketplace is fair and it fairly reflects what Parliament, Westminster in this case, has regulated for you to enforce. So I'm going to ask you, I didn't think that the answer you gave to Alexander Stewart was particularly convincing, because instead of talking about ensuring that the 8% that the BBC is required to programme, that they're required to make in Scotland, was going to be made in Scotland by local production, it sounded like you were creating a massive loophole by talking about nuance and flexibility. How committed is the regulator, Ofcom, to insisting that that 8% is not just a tick box for the BBC, and that programme is actually being made by locally based production companies? Because I didn't hear any assurance to Mr Stewart's question that that was your intention at all.
Well, that is our intention. We can have differing views. We really welcome the fact that the production in Scotland has really flourished over the years, and that we have to make sure that, as well as providing regulatory framework, we also don't stifle innovation and creativity. Now, production companies tend to have just a few people when they, permanent staff. Quite a lot of production companies will have 2 or 3 people that are based here, and then when they get a commission, they will obviously start hiring people. And you don't need to be an expert to know that it's much better to hire people locally than to be driving them or flying them all the way up from London all the time. So it has happened in the past, but let's take traitors, for example, which I'm sure somebody will want to talk about.
Adam didn't mention traitors. It's something that he's brought up in the past. Yeah.
So Scotland there hadn't been a high-end reality programme made in Scotland before. Studio Lambert decided that they wanted to film it in Scotland. That first series became incredibly popular, and they brought in people who had done reality TV programmes before, because no one in Scotland had made one before. And that's just what the situation was. We haven't still got all the exact information yet for the following series. There was an error made in terms of the reporting of the production and the makeup of it and all everything on that first series. But undoubtedly, Traitors has put Scotland and Scottish production really right on the map. We are understanding from the BBC and from Studio Lambert that more and more, as each series comes, more people locally being hired. Scotland is now a place that's shown the world that it can make high-end reality programmes. Now, if we'd been really restrictive and said to Studio Lambert, I'm sorry, you can only make this first series in Scotland with very, very narrow things, they may not have come here. And they might not have brought anyone with them, and they might not have taught things.
But the point is, I
so it's a balance.
I hear the rationale and understand the rationale.
Yeah.
But what's Ofcom going to do to see that that actually does happen? Because at the end of the day, as Scottish parliamentarians, we're interested in creating a sustainable creative industry in this segment in Scotland, rather than just something that flies in, makes a programme, flies out. So what are you going to do?
We're going to make sure that the BBC delivers on what they said they're going to do, and to make sure that the numbers are accurate when they're being reported, and we will scrutinise as each series
comes in. So this nuance, this language of nuance and flexibility and headwinds, almost as a get-out-of-jail card for the BBC. I misheard that then.
You didn't mishear it. I mean, as I said, with all regulation and to making sure that we don't make it hard for Studio Lambert to come here to make it. We want to carry on them doing it in Scotland. But if I turn around to them and say, well, Series 4 has got to have, 9 cameramen from Scotland and only 1 from England, we don't want to be doing that. But if they turned around to me and they said, look, we really wanted to do 9, but at the moment, we can't find a 9th, and we want, we're going to have to do 8. Yeah. That's the kind of nuance we're talking about.
I get that.
Realism.
So let me ask you then, from an Ofcom point of view, when it comes to the Charter, and particularly Article 14, that talks about ensuring that authentic portrayal and representation of communities is part of BBC programming, what is your definition and standard against which you measure the BBC's compliance with that Article 14?
Well, I think the BBC We do a report every year into the BBC's performance on all of its public purposes emissions. In terms of the next charter going forward, what actually is the wording of that? And
But what does that wording actually mean currently from an Ofcom interpretation? You're the regulator. You've interpreted, I presume, Article 14.
Yes.
What's your interpretation?
Well, our interpretation is every year, as I said, we do a review.
No,
BBC
what does
and-
authentic portrayal and representation of communities mean? What kind of programming, what kind of tangible measurement? I know you're reporting, I get that, but what's your tangible measurement of that? How do we know if the BBC is fulfilling Article 14 in a
Well,
Scottish context?
we've called out in previous years that we still think they're struggling with younger audiences and with lower socioeconomic
So they're
groups.
failing in this?
They've got more to do, is how I'd put it,
Right.
in that area.
It's
There isn't
too-
a metric.
It's too, forgive me, it's too vague, the answers you're giving. I mean, there's a specific here, authentic portrayal and representation of communities. I don't know that Ofcom has got an interpretation of that that's measurable, so you're able to say, yes, the BBC is doing that, or the BBC is not doing that. And that's at the crux of the River City stuff, by the way, I think. So I think it's important that Ofcom clearly articulates what Article 14 means.
I think we do that. So I think the annual report that we have to produce on the BBC looks at how they deliver the kind of mission and public purposes that covers the sorts of things that you're talking about, and whether or not they are meeting the operating licence requirements that we put in relation to kind of individual public services. And now the way in which we assess that is to talk to audiences. We haven't really spoken a lot about audiences. And I think that those questions about whether or not people hear their voices, see their lives and those sorts of things, which is the way in which we define this type of stuff, we ask audiences about. So we come to Scotland, we do focus groups here, we do omnibus surveys here. Into
and what are
the
audiences
thousands.
saying then?
Well, exactly what Christina said, that on the whole,
They're happy
they think
with
the no, I wouldn't go as far as saying happy. I'd say on the whole, the BBC is delivering on its remit in these types of areas. But as Christina said, there are areas where there has to be scope for improvement. So particularly around how you serve younger audiences, particularly how you serve DE in those kind of social classes.
Right.
And what our job is to do is to say, this is what the audiences have told us, BBC, you need to demonstrate how you're going to change it. Now that's the type of thing we'll be reporting on later this year, having told the BBC in previous years that they needed to up their game in this area.
Okay, we will watch for that with interest. I've got two other quick questions to ask if convener's patience allows it. The Online Safety Act, because we can't talk about TV and radio, we can't talk about one segment of broadcast without talking about the platforms that now exist. Does Ofcom have the powers to properly protect children from harmful or age-inappropriate content online? Do you have the powers?
Yes.
Are you using them?
Yes.
What have you done?
So, over the last... So since the Online Safety Act was passed, we were required by the UK Parliament to put in place a couple of regimes around illegal harms, and particularly focused on protection of children. Now, what I should say about the online safety process is it's not a kind of take-down regime. So it doesn't give Ofcom powers to reach into platforms and say, you've got to take this particular type of content down. It doesn't do that. It's a systems and processes regime that's about ensuring that companies have all of the right preparation and systems in place to stop that content appearing on it in the first place. And what the Act requires us to do is produce guidance to tell companies how they can go about doing that.
But no powers to enforce it?
No, it does. It does. So you've asked what we've been doing, and we can share all of this with the committee. We actually have been sharing this with different Scottish Parliament committees over the course of the last 12 or 18 months. We're required to consult on the guidance that we applied to companies. So we've done that on illegal harms. It deals with issues like terrorism, child sexual abuse and exploitation, and child sexual abuse material that you see online. All of that is out there and available for people to see. And pornography? Yes, and on pornography as well. And we did those two things slightly separately. So we did the illegal harms piece first, because that's what Parliament required us to do, and then we moved on to the child protection piece. Both of those have been produced, and both of those are now reaching the enforcement stage. So the companies have to demonstrate to us by July of this year that they have the systems in place to do that. If they do not do that, that's when we can come to enforce. And there are different... I think this is really important. There are different disruption measures. Some of them are about fining. and they can be up to 10% of global turnover, so significant sums
And
of
that
money.
reaches outside of the United Kingdom?
Well, yeah, so the Act applies within the UK, and it relates to UK users and kind of user-to-user services.
So the user in the UK, the content might be produced on a platform that's outside the United Kingdom. Do you have powers over those sites?
So we have the Act only extends into the United Kingdom, but we can engage. We can still fine a company for things that are happening to users in the UK. So it's still possible.
And what's the
us to
ultimate
fine
sanction
a US.
you take against
well,
the
so
company?
so this is the point about there are other disruption measures as well. So if we don't, so fining is an option, but there are other business disruption measures. So we can ultimately go to the courts to seek like a stopping things like payment systems, or ultimately from a website, for example, being available in the United Kingdom.
Right.
So we can go to that
Right.
that level if it's necessary, and we are concerned that the harms are such in the areas that you've identified that,
Yeah.
that UK users can no longer access that type of content.
That's another thing that we obviously want to watch
Yeah.
the development on, because, well, as you can probably tell, I've got strong views about
Well,
what is accessible to children currently on the online. And my last question is about the Royal Mail. So there's a bunch of stuff going on with the Royal Mail currently.
Yep.
You'll understand that I regularly get constituents who tell me how poor the Royal Mail service now is in certain parts of
Yeah.
my constituency, and indeed in wider Scotland, particularly in rural and remoter areas, but it also applies to urban areas. What powers does Ofcom have to enforce the universal standard obligation that the Royal Mail currently, I think, is giving lip service to?
So I don't know if you've seen this, Mr Kerr, but last week we've just announced an investigation into the Royal Mail for not meeting
I have seen
its
that.
quality of service
Yeah.
targets. So we fined them over the last 2 years for not meeting their quality of service targets, and we've just started an enforcement process again with Royal Mail having announced they're kind of not having met their quality of service targets. So those are the mechanisms that we've got. It's worth saying we've been in the middle of looking at the sustainability of the universal service. So the Scottish Affairs Committee is having me and one of my other group directors in front of it to talk about exactly these sorts of issues at Westminster in a couple of weeks. But we do have and we will have to reach a view on whether we think there need to be changes to the universal
Well, you've already
service.
said that I think, and I'm referring to the announcement you're referring to, that the universal service urgently needs reform. I think that's a quote from what Ofcom said. Do you want to kind of elucidate on what that actually means, urgently needs reform? Because some of the ideas that have been floated around this issue are, for example, that second-class letters wouldn't be delivered by a certain time or on certain days, that the service wouldn't be 6 days a week, that, there's all kinds of even further retreats from the universal service obligation. So what does it mean?
So, I mean, it's fundamentally about whether it's like the USO is a sustainable thing, whether it's an affordable thing. It's quite old. I think we have to face that. We've looked at a lot of European and other international models. I think it was the Swedes or Danes who have just done away with their universal service obligation to recognise there's a massive shift in how people use their communications. I guess at the heart of all of this is what people actually tell us they need. So we talked a bit about the audience point in relation to broadcasting, and we've similarly done research on user needs for the postal service. Being frank with you, when I first saw those user needs, I expected people in rural and remote communities in particular to say to us, it has to stay as it is. They didn't. And we've published all of this research. What they said is the quality of service has to be good and it has to be reliable. So I'm actually less bothered if something comes less frequently, but I want the thing to actually turn up, particularly when it's a hospital appointment or something like that. So those are the kinds of issues that we're having to look at and say, well, to what extent does the universal service deliver this, and then how will we hold the Royal Mail to account to deliver this type of stuff?
The urgently needed reforms that Ofcom identify are around the consistency.
Exactly, reliability. That's exactly right. Exactly
the reliability, absolutely.
Yeah. And can I add to this? This is not just a rural and remote problem.
No,
it's an urban problem, right? So we've had correspondence with Cockab Stewart in her MSP capacity in the last handful of weeks about the G1 to G5 postcodes because people were not getting the service that they needed. It was exactly the same experience that people
we have
were
an
getting
excellent postie in our street, but I tell you, the man is weighed down because of what he's expected to do. I mean, get the mail all kinds of hours of the day and night. And I think something is changing, but the predictability
Yeah.
and the reliability issue does need to be reinforced.
And this is exactly the space that we're
And that's
occupying with this. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a supplementary on Mr Kerr's issue about online issues? Do you have the ability to influence what happens on social media sites as well, like the big ones like X, Instagram, these sort of apps?
Well, I mean, I guess the point about the regime is that it requires all of the social media platforms, so the ones you've mentioned and many, many more. There's a lot of services that are caught by the Online Safety Act to have in place the systems and processes that meet the requirements that the Act and then we in enforcing it have got to do. So yes, all of those organisations will have to comply in the UK with what the Act requires of them.
And well, I realise that everything's moved to a 24-hour news cycle and, you know, people have access to it. If I give the example of the horrendous incidents in Liverpool at the weekend, one of the asks of the police was that people stop sharing what was very, very difficult content. And Mr Kerr, you know, obviously that's accessible to any young person or teenager that's on that site as well.
Yeah.
So did you have any ability to act to get these particular parts of content down quickly in that scenario?
Well, I mean, I should reinforce this point about this is not a content takedown regime. So the Act itself and the powers that are given to Ofcom do not allow us to step in and say particular pieces of content have to be taken down. We need to be really clear about that issue. It's about those systems and processes that those platforms have in place to stop that type of content going up in the first place. Now, there's a couple of things to say here, and if the committee haven't seen it, we're definitely happy to share this. So when we had the horrendous Southport attacks last year, we looked at, this was before the Online Safety Act had taken effect and before we had powers that, you know, to allow us to kind of intervene in these sorts of issues. We looked at what happened in those instances because there were examples of what you were describing about content going up, you know, triggering unrest and violence. And we've published our findings on that. And if you haven't seen it, we're very happy to share it with you. And we do think that the platforms were slow in acting to, you know, and understanding what was going on in that area. Now, the interesting thing about the example that you've just provided about those horrendous scenes that we saw in Liverpool is how quickly, you know, the authorities have come out saying, do not do this and do not share this. Exactly, because of the learning, because of some of the research and findings that Ofcom have done to try and encourage not just the platforms themselves, but everybody involved in responding to that sort of incident work together to make sure it's dealt with as safely as possible.
Okay. Thank you. Mr Bibby.
Morning. There's been consistent calls on Ofcom and the BBC from the Scottish screen sector to increase production in Scotland and the share of production. Mr Stewart earlier said that the BBC's change of tack announced last week maybe suggested they weren't adhering to the spirit of the guidance that Ofcom have laid out. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it would be the BBC's decision suggests that Ofcom's rules on Scottish qualification have been, to quote you, too flexible to ensure projects the BBC Commission deliver value for money in Scotland. Is that right in terms of, you know, when you talk about too flexible, that could also mean too weak?
I think the results speak for themselves. As we've said, the production sector in Scotland has been one of real success. The industry around the whole of the UK is at a really difficult time at the moment, with audiences really fragmenting onto lots of different places. The tech giants are sort of, coming into that space as well. So there's a real pressure on the industry. Again, you know, we like looking at numbers, and you know, there are still, I think there's now 51 active production companies making stuff in Scotland now, where there was about 32 in 2014. So there is the evidence shows that you know, the production sector here is flourishing. Our guidance is guidance, and as Glenn said earlier, for the vast majority of what the BBC was doing here, they were sticking to two out of three of those criteria. But we welcome the fact that they are that they're going further, and again, it's about making sure not only do they stick to their remit and their public purpose, but also the audiences are seeing themselves reflected on screens, and that's hugely important, and something that we welcome and encourage. There will be different viewpoints, but the evidence, as I said, the industry is doing well. It's facing the same headwinds as others are doing. I note from a recent survey that actually the production sector here is struggling less than in other parts of the United Kingdom. There's a really flourishing thing here. It's going well. I would say that's probably quite good evidence that the guidelines are working.
Okay, Mr. Lilly, can I just add a couple of additional thoughts? So I've been in front of this committee before to talk about regional production, and we did actually review our guidance across 2017-2018, and we updated it. We recognised at the time that it needed some tightening up, and that including on how these kind of returns were done, how we reported, what happened if people felt they wanted to report to us concerns about numbers, and we have given effect to all of that. We actually gave it effect in 2021, having done that work across those couple of years, recognising the long lead times for broadcasters and production companies in producing content. So it's been in that revised guidance has been in place over the last 3 or 4 years. And on the whole, it seemed to have been working pretty comfortably. And then what we've had is these couple of instances that Christina mentioned. So, we talked about the traitors, for example, where people have started to express concern about it. And what we've said at the moment is we want to kind of implement the Media Act and really focus on the provisions in that. But we are happy to look at the guidance again if there's a feeling that it needs to be changed again.
Thanks for that answer. Do you think the BBC's change of tact and position highlights the need to look at that guidance again?
At the end of the day, it's the results that count rather than how we get somewhere. And their decision to increase their production is, as I said, one that we welcome. As Glenn said, we've got the Media Act, which we're implementing. Let's let that settle down. Let's see how it's working with the various tech giants, and maybe have a look at it again in a couple of years' time when the Media Act's been implemented properly. I'm not ruling it out.
Yeah, can I just add an additional thought on that? So I don't think that the announcement does suggest that it requires that immediately. And actually, it's an interesting announcement. I think it's a really good announcement. I think it's the reality is that the vast majority of what the BBC in particular do already, as Christina said, meets at least 2, if not 3. Right, so nearly 90% of what they do. So it is a very small number of shows that you would be talking about. So I think it's really positive, actually, that they're saying, look, we're listening, we're going to do this differently. We want to meet two or three of the criteria. I think the thing that I feel nervous about with being overly prescriptive is the risk of disincentivization of investment. I really do genuinely worry about that. Christina, she gave the kind of Traitors and Studio Lambert example. There'll be other production companies that think the same thing, where, if you've got the regulator kind of reaching in, it's the broadcasters that are bound by the rules, but they have to work with the production companies to help meet them. You've got the regulator reaching in and telling them, who they should be employing and where they should be making things. I really do worry that disincentivizes investment, and I want companies to come to Scotland and make stuff and use local people to do so. And I equally want Scottish companies to be able to go and make something in other bits of the UK as well. And I think there's a real risk if we become overly prescriptive that we disincentivise them from doing that.
You mentioned the importance earlier of audience seeing themselves on screens, and in response to Mr Kerr, you talked about the BBC needed to do more to build support from audiences with above average economic and social needs. Presumably on BBC Scotland, cutting a drama like River City, which is about a working class community and working class voices, will make that situation only worse. Have you looked at that situation, or will you be looking at that decision?
Definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't tell the BBC what to do editorially. At the end, they've got to decide how they want to spend their public money and what they want to produce within the quotas and the guidance we issue. And they made a commercial decision to River City, its audiences were going down. They need to spend their money where the audiences are. So, younger people are not looking at linear TV anymore. They need to, and they've announced, I think, a couple of plans to replace to spend that money elsewhere, and we will be making sure that they are again reflecting all parts of the socio-economic groups here in Scotland and elsewhere. It's kind of up to them to decide how they're going to do that. We wouldn't be prescriptive and say, you must make this kind of programme at this time of day. But it's really important that the BBC is able to be innovative. As I said, audiences now are fragmented in a way they certainly weren't when I started in my broadcasting career. And so it's really important that BBC creates content where people are getting it.
I've still got a lot of work to do in terms of younger audiences, but also people with above average economic social needs. That's what
we found, and that's what we've been hearing from people. And I can't predict what the effect will have. We'll have to see once they've done a year without River City to see what people are saying to us. But it is, it's about audiences, and it's about what audiences want. The audience for that particular programme had been declining over the years. Linear TV, as we all know, is rapidly declining in numbers. The BBC's got to make content where people are watching it.
Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you. Mr Brown?
I suppose for me, in thinking about the role of Ofcom, it's useful to think about examples of what Ofcom could be, really, I suppose. And I'm thinking about Canada. I think it was Pierre Trudeau, Justin's dad, that said being in Canada was like being in bed with an elephant, because the US, its southern neighbour, was 10 times its size, and the danger of kind of complete cultural overspill was huge. So in Canada, they had things like quotas for the number of lecturers in the universities must be Canadian. And one of the dark secrets of my past is I was a radio DJ, which sounds a bit grand, and it's a Sunday night campus radio, but I was obliged to play a certain number of Canadian songs during the course of that 2-hour programme. And if you contrast that with what Ofcom are doing here, we've heard lots of talk about nuance and guidance and maybe increasing it and so on. But Ofcom agreed with the BBC last year when they decided to reduce news output by, I think, half, from 250 hours to 125. George Adams mentioned what's happened to radio in Scotland in terms of feeling like it's a local radio, which it does not feel like anymore. They've also had the situation, I started campaigning in 2007 to have Scottish football matches free to air. It took a long, long time before that got anywhere, and when it did, we had the absolute fiasco of the Greek match, where the sound didn't work, the coverage didn't work. So out of touch were they from doing that kind of thing, the BBC. You have no target for Scotland for Channel 4, and you seem to be content with that. So I suppose, and I understand the point that Ofcom is the creature of Parliament, the UK Parliament. And if it decides that you're going to be toothless, as George Adam put it, then that's what you have to be, and you have to work within that. But just for a specific question, over the last 5 years, you may have covered this, and it may be in the briefing, but I couldn't see it. What has been the record of the BBC in terms of the 8% that it's, I wouldn't say obliged, but it's asked to deliver in terms of content from Scotland? And do you make any distinction between something like Traitors, which, and I heard the explanation earlier on, but it's not Scottish in any meaningful way apart from the venue that it's filmed in? What is the BBC's track record over, say, the last 5 to 10 years in terms of the 8% requirement?
I don't have the data going back that far. I do know that in the last couple of years they have met their quotas. Going further back, I don't have the data to hand, but we can provide that.
Yeah, so it is an obligation. That's an important thing to say. So it is part of the operating licence that Ofcom sets for the BBC, the 8% on spending hours. And Christina's right. I think since we assumed, so bear in mind we didn't regulate the BBC until 2017. So it's been over the last eight years. We've not had an instance where it has not met the 8%.
And on the issue of what counts as, I forget what the obligation is it production based in Scotland or whatever
There's three. There's a substantive base, there's production spend, and there's off-screen talent. They're the three buckets, if you like, of criteria.
I think the point that was made when we had the cast and employee representatives of River City here is what the BBC are doing essentially is doing away with almost like a cultural college where, you know, sound recorders, camera people, production staff, actors and actresses can get their start in Scotland. That's going by the board, which seems to be a huge loss. But going back to the example you used of traitors, and you mentioned that, well, there was no history in Scotland of having, I forget how you termed it, a live
High-end reality show, I think.
reality show, yeah. That's what condemns the track record, the fact that we had no talent to do that. And then to compound that by saying, we're going to allow BBC or whoever to do this, whoever produced it to do this, because we don't have those kind of staff. That's what happens when you don't invest. And that's the purpose. You would think that, I would have thought that Ofcom would have a vested interest in making sure that the cultural capacity in terms of the media in Scotland was sustained and sustainable. And that's, the traitors are an example of the fact that did not happen. You didn't have people involved in that. Do you have a remit, or are you concerned about the decline in the cultural capacity? And I'm talking across all the skills and trades as well as the actors. And I'll let you answer that question. I'll come back to my last question.
I'm not convinced that there's been a decline necessarily. I mean, the numbers show that the production capabilities here have doubled, as Glenn said, over the last few years.
But not a single person with the ability to do high-end live reality shows.
Yeah, I mean...
Well, not a single person. I think there are small. I think you're right that the numbers are small, but I think there unquestionably have been people that are capable of doing that. But I guess part of the point of wanting it to be made here is that what you can do is get that pipeline to have the talent to be able to do more and more of this. So that when they become returning series, you know, what you have is more people that are locally based making that content.
I mean, the fact that, I don't think, I'm trying to think how long high-end reality TV's been going. I probably started about, I suppose depends whether you call Big Brother high-end or not, but those kinds of programmes are, you know, probably about 15 years old. I mean, again, I think it's about making sure that, there's a skills shortage in Scotland, actually, but the production companies need people with more skills. I think it's really important that the BBC, whatever they decide to spend their River City money on, if you use a phrase, it's in their own interest as well to make sure that there is a continued pipeline of emerging talent, all those skills that are required, that Skills Scotland and Screen Scotland and this government has been investing in. And it doesn't do the BBC any help at all whatsoever if those skills are not here. So I think making sure that whatever new programmes they make, that there is a continuing pipeline and a continuing training scheme will be really important for them. And Channel 4 has also invested a lot in skills training in Scotland as well. These at the end of the day, there's a commercial reality to it. It is good and beneficial for the companies to make sure that the skills are here.
Mr. Dunn, can I add just one additional thought on this? So I think we will want to see what comes next. And you've got the BBC here shortly, so I guess you can ask them. I think they have talked about making kind of more formal announcements in the autumn about, particularly on that issue around how the kind of training academy, as you described it from River City, is something that they can continue to kind of focus on and develop people into the sector. I was looking at a good announcement yesterday, which was, I don't know if you know TRC, who's the company that do training to encourage people into the production sector. They're a Glasgow-based company, a brilliant company who we meet quite regularly, and they've got investment from Screen Scotland, from BBC and from Channel 4, as Christina was just saying, announced yesterday about exactly this issue. How do we encourage people into this industry who are not typically going to come to it? And there's a whole new programme that's going to be out there that they're running that's co-funded by those different partners. So I think there is some action in this area, but we'll definitely want to keep shining a light on it and seeing what the BBC plan to do.
And is that the extent of your role? I asked the BBC it wasn't the BBC, I asked the folk from River City over here, whether, because the BBC seems to have a symbiotic relationship with Netflix and others, whereby BBC expenditure and the experience and capacity that creates is very useful to Netflix and others when they consider if they're going to come to Scotland, notwithstanding what you said about skill shortages and so on. Does it not seem sensible to try and get those different players around the table and get them to agree a proper way where they can have a stream of that kind of talent coming forward, whether it's production assistants, camera people, all the rest of it. Or is that not part of your role at all?
As part of our public service review, which we'll be publishing in the middle of July, we are looking at the role that the streamers play. There have been all sorts of public discussions about whether there should be a tax on them, whether there should be... I think the streamers actually do invest quite a lot of money in some training things. Adolescents, for example, I think they did a lot of work when they were filming it in that area in the north of England. They did a lot of work with the local community, did a lot of open days, come and see how you can become a cameraman, sound recorders, etc. We don't specifically measure what they bring in from a regulatory point of view, but I think there has been quite a lot of discussion from things like Screen Scotland and the BBC and Channel 4 to make sure that that pipeline of talent is there, but also that, as I said, I don't think there's a remit for Netflix to insist on paying a certain amount of money for training, but I'm sure they would say that their very investment here is bringing that.
I appreciate it maybe because of the nature of your remit, but it seems to be extremely passive, shining a light, issuing guidance, being flexible, nuance, those kind of things, where it seems to me a much more active role in trying to encourage a vibrant sector would be useful. But my last question is really on the issue of sports fans in general, but football fans in particular in Scotland, being able to see matches which are important to them. That has been declining again. I mean, apart from the lack of free-to-air that we've had, the coverage for Scottish football in the other broadcasters at UK level is pretty appalling. Is that something that Ofcom are concerned with or involved with at all?
Yeah. So yes, to a degree, and I'll explain that because it is quite complicated. I guess the good news, which you'll be aware of, was the BBC kind of securing that exclusive deal to broadcast Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland's men's international football in the run-up to next year's World Cup. So it's 41 live matches over the next 15 months. This is, I guess, the remit here is around listed events, and their kind of sporting or other events are kind of national interest, and they are those listed events are designated by the UK Secretary of State, and that's not something that Ofcom has a role in. So it's something that the UK government of whatever colour takes to the UK Parliament and says these are the things that they think should be shown on free to air, and then the job for us is to look at the kind of the acquisition of exclusive rights, and are the organisations that have bought them, have they done that in a fair way, and then give consent to them to be broadcasting if we feel that they have, and that's the kind of limitation of our role. So, but we've heard these sorts of arguments for quite a long time, and it's one for the governments to have a conversation and say, are there things that we think we need to change about the list of kind of designated things that are deemed to be of national significance, and it's a choice about what they then put on that. And if they do decide they want to add things like Scotland's men's international matches, for example, then we would come in and do the kind of regulatory function that we're asked to do under the regime.
I get the fact that you're a regulator and you don't have this power, but the idea that Westminster governments now for decades, I think, have refused to list Scotland's men's, you could argue women's football team events, and so people in Scotland have to watch England play Albania and they can't watch Scotland play Spain or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That doesn't concern you as an organisation then?
Well, look, I think we're obviously, if it's free to air, that's a positive thing for audiences. But that's where there's a limitation on our role. It's not, we don't have the opportunity to say this is what we think should be on or shouldn't be on a designated list. It's a decision that the government makes, and Parliament then passes legislation to that effect.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Can I just ask a couple of quick supplementaries, then I'll bring in Mr. Harvey. In terms of what Mr. Brown was saying, I noticed at the weekend, now I have, as the other members of the committee know, I have very little interest in football, but I did notice that the national news had some of the England team and the England women's team successes in Europe, and the Aberdeen winning the cup wasn't featured on the national news. So is there a disparity in the way that the national content is biased against the home nations? And should the national news be doing more to highlight what's happening in Scotland and to cover some of that content?
Anecdotally, from my previous career as running newsrooms at ITV and at Channel 5, I would have been, and at Sky, I would have been very cross if one of our programmes hadn't put the Aberdeen result out, because, yeah, national news programmes should be doing the news for everybody. Look, we don't get into those. Ofcom doesn't have those editorial powers, those requirements to say to individual news programmes, you know, I can't ring up, I don't know which channel it was on the need to say, I can't ring them up and say that was really bad. I don't, you know, there's no formal to do that. But again, you know, we do make sure that overall we insist that there is a proper reflection of everyone in the UK. But there is no mechanism for us to say you've broken a rule there, therefore we're going to fine you. That's done through sort of softer power, I suppose. You know, I might send a text. If you let me know later if it was, I might send a text. But it was a classic thing when I was editing ITV's news at 10 for many years, making sure that we didn't just cover England football results, that we covered Scottish ones as well.
Thank you. And in terms of Channel 4, it's been mentioned a couple of times as well. And we've heard today about how sometimes the quotas can lead to a sort of tick box feeling about how things are implemented and gathering that data. But what's the rationale of not setting quotas for Channel 4 and the way they are for the BBC?
The BBC obviously is a public funded organisation. Channel 4 is publicly owned, so there's something slightly different there. We have given, you know, we have sort of tried to make sure that we, you know, Channel 4 has to report to us and be really transparent about where it's commissioning content. They themselves have, I think they did something like 11% spend outside England over the last year, and again, it's about balancing the most important thing is the outcome, isn't it? What actually is being made here and what actually is being seen by audiences and valued by them. And I think that it's a balance between making sure that that outcome happens without stifling innovation or ideas or being able to be flexible. And as I think we've spoken by evidence, the evidence shows that there is a burgeoning and flourishing production sector here. Of course, we want that to continue. And of course, but I don't think that by being really prescriptively regulatory, that will necessarily bring the outcome. And you know, so far, it's not doing a bad job. Don't underestimate the huge changes that are going on in audiences. For example, again, talking about my own experiences, when I edited ITV's News at 10 in 2010, we'd have an audience of 5 or 6 million. Now, about 2 million people are watching that programme. And I think that audiences are fragmenting and they're going to very different places. And it's really important that the content, the great content that's still being made, and whether it's shown on Netflix or it's on BBC, that it's being made where people are watching. And so I think the outcome is the thing that we measure, and we're a very evidence-based organisation. We do a huge amount of research. It's the outcome that's important. And I maintain that making a balance between guidance and quotas and giving people the ability to be innovative and flexible and take a bit of a punt, a bit of a gamble, I think that's really important.
So Channel 4 have the out of England target, and you said that they're making 11% outside of England. Do we have a Scottish figure in that?
I don't think we do at the moment, but so we relicensed Channel 4 last year, and I mean actually their out of England quotas increased. It was 3% originally. It moved to 9% a number of years ago, and then for the duration of the next licence, so by the end of the next licence in 2030, it's up to 12%. But you're right that that's an out of England quota. But the other thing that we've required Channel 4 to do is report against their performance in each of the nations. So that will be coming.
In a year's time, you'll see.
So you will be able to work out, how much Channel 4 is producing in Scotland as part of the overall 12% target.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harvey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning. I still can't help shaking the feeling that we still have an approach to regulation of the BBC, scrutiny of the BBC, our political debate about the BBC that derives from a time when it was massively dominant. It was massively dominant in terms of the economics of production, in terms of storytelling and culture, in terms of news, and it's now a player in a market. The legislation that you mentioned, the Online Safety Act and the Media Act, it seems to me might catch us up with where we should have been 20 years ago, but don't address fully the landscape that we're now in and what it's going to continue to evolve into. The Media Act does give you some powers in relation to video on demand, and I was looking at your website to see if the consultation on that is out yet. I haven't seen it, so I'm going to ask about the context of that and the scope and the breadth of it. But I'll connect it to the point that Convener made about the Liverpool incident very recently. The BBC quite properly immediately started saying this is not being reported as a terrorist incident, the suspect is white. That didn't matter at all, because huge numbers of people were immediately fed lies saying that this was an immigrant or that this was a terrorist attack, and there's nothing at all about that regulated parts of news can do to stop the proliferation, the very deliberate proliferation of lies, conspiracy theories. And it's by no means the only example where major video-on-demand platforms are actively promoting conspiracy theories, far-right propaganda, public health misinformation, as we saw during COVID. So what is Ofcom now empowered to do under the Media Act in relation to those very, very profound challenges about disinformation, conspiracy theories, for example, political neutrality in an election on those other platforms, major video-on-demand platforms, as well as the proliferation of social media platforms?
Things there, because so the Media Act, you referred to the Video on Demand Code. So we are required to draw up a Video on Demand Code, and I think we could bring out the consultation later on this year. Okay. It will be very much based broadly around the aims of the Broadcast Code. So protecting audiences from harm, due impartiality and due accuracy of news, etc., etc. It'll look pretty similar. That will be going out to consultation. I think once we've published that code, we will then start looking at whether we try and bring the two together, because at the end of the day, people are consuming things across different platforms. In terms of the specifics about mis and disinformation, that was decided by Parliament not to be included in the Online Safety Act in terms of protection from harms. There is no legislative lever that we have to sort of, as you said, it's not a takedown regime on the Online Safety Act. So, and I'm not going to go into whether it wasn't my decision, but whether it was the right decision or not. It's just very hard to define what is information and what is disinformation, and you and I might have very different views on it. I suspect we have quite similar views, but different people would have different views. So there are again other levers. So actually next month, it's June. Yeah, in June we are having the third of a series of roundtables we've been having with the platforms and with the broadcasters to talk about how people can make what I want to do is to make sure that people can find duly impartial, accurate news, which we have a framework which the broadcasters provide. Now, at the moment, the broadcasters don't have to comply their content on social media platforms to the same standards as the Broadcasting Code, but they all choose to, because actually it's good for their brand. So when I was at Sky, I was in charge of TV and digital output, and I'd get people coming to me and saying, well, we don't have to stick to the rules for this. And I said, no, you do, because it's part of our brand. Our news is accurate and impartial. And so we're bringing the platforms and the broadcasters together. There's been some discussion, again, about giving prominence on social media to public service broadcasting outlets. Again, we'll be addressing that in the Public Service Media Review. Again, though, I mean, what does prominence look like on a TikTok feed? I don't know. Yeah. So we're working to facilitate. We want the broadcasters and the platforms to talk together about how do we make sure that people can get in their feed. May I just finish? The other point is we have a big responsibility in terms of media literacy, and it's about teaching people to know that what they see on social media is not necessarily isn't as regulated as it is on the TV.
I agree with the importance of that point. It's all the more important because we have an unregulated landscape, though. And the phrase that you used twice is that making sure people can find or can access impartial and accurate content. Can I suggest, though, that that will be entirely ineffective if they can find some accurate and impartial information if they go looking for it, but are being bombarded actively with the very opposite of that. Can you confirm that the work that you're doing on video on demand is not going to, and I don't think you're empowered to, require, for example, YouTube as a content provider to pay due regard to impartiality and accuracy in the content that it provides to everybody? They're just not going to do that.
The Secretary of State is going to designate what they call the Tier 1 providers, and I don't think that there's a separate issue with YouTube because they are not actually they're a platform, but they're not a producer of content. So that's a slightly different thing. No, there is no legislation to say that TikTok or Facebook are not allowed to run a certain kind of content. I don't think there's any regime in the world that's achieved that. Lots of people have looked at possibilities. It's that balance of freedom of expression versus protecting audiences from harm. And I think that what we can do is work in many ways different as possible. And I do think media literacy is a huge important part of that. Again, our evidence shows, for example, I think now something like 60% of people are getting their news off social media. But interestingly, during the general election that we had, the UK one, there was people were telling us they were going to the broadcasters to get their political news because they knew that it was more accurate and impartial. And I think that educating people is really important to know. People know that what they see on TikTok is not always right. And there will be people who go down conspiracy theories.
Some do, but you yourself referred to the racist riots last year, which were sparked by online misinformation, propaganda, racism, and quite deliberately stirred up in that way. So some people will tell the difference between truth and lies when they see it, and some people will understand that social media content is not going to be honest or reliable. Others won't. And even your point about the responsibility of the broadcasters isn't changed when, for example, just this week, the main regulated broadcasters covering a Reform Party press conference just broadcast their racist film about Anas Sarwar. Uncritically, unquestioningly. Just the cameras turned to the projection of that film and it was broadcast to the nation on regulated mainstream news channels.
Well, we will be, in terms of that, there is a requirement for those channels to be duly impartial. Duly is important here. It would be unusual, I didn't see the whole of that programme. It would be unusual, in my experience, to take that live and then have no commentary, rebuttal, response from Labour. I would find that would be strange. I don't know exactly whether there's been complaints about it and we're investigating. As I said, I haven't seen the whole context of that. It's slightly two different things. So, whatever broadcasters choose to take a press conference and whatever is said in that press conference, they have a responsibility to be duly impartial. So I would expect them in their coverage to, whoever's giving a political press conference, there to be some sort of response or rebuttal. On the wider thing about, making sure that there is, that there is not information or disinformation or wild theories or racism and etc. on social media, I think it's fair to say that we don't have powers to do that.
Yeah. So that remains a massive gap in regulation of the news that people consume.
It is in terms of. I think it'd be very difficult. It's a topic you could spend days discussing. Yeah. What is news? Exactly. How do you regulate news? it's news only what broadcasters put out or respectable companies. It's a very difficult area, and it's an area that I think will take up a lot of discussion in the future. But as I said, we're trying to bring people together, the platforms and the broadcasters, to make sure that their stuff, that the reporting they do, is given people are getting easier access to it, and I think that's a really important tool.
Thank you, Camilla.
Can I ask a quick final question? We've mentioned, particularly Christina, you've mentioned the audience quite a bit. So how open are you to the public contacting you with concerns, and how do you engage generally with audiences to ensure that you're getting the information from them?
We're really incredibly transparent. On our website, we have all the, it's a fairly simple process to complain about a programme. We will, when there's complaints made about programmes, we follow them up, we assess the bit of content. Quite often people make complaints about a programme judged on something as a clip they've seen on social media rather than the whole programme. But we do interact. We have, we've got a really sort of grassroots format, I suppose, with our advisory panels in the UK, in England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. We're very forward-facing. We do a huge amount of research. We do some really, I think we did one came out recently, and I would encourage members to take a look at it. The news report, the news adult media use we report on, so we look at those trends. Some of them are quite stark and quite frightening. I think the drop in linear television audience is going faster than even we'd predicted. So I think we have a pretty good grasp on what the public are telling us, and we do encourage people to get in touch. And we're very open to, we engage with all sorts of different stakeholders, and I talk about audiences a lot because I think that's actually what is the most important thing. We're here to, in my role, I'm here to make sure audiences get a really great range of content that they love and engage with. Overall, Ofcom is there to make sure that consumers are getting the best services that they can.
It's maybe worth saying, so for instance, in relation to our telecoms responsibilities, we don't have responsibility for individual complaints, but with broadcasting we do. So it is possible for someone, as Christina said, to use our website. We actually have a consumer contact centre that serves people across the whole UK that can take calls and complaints as well. It's probably worth acknowledging that in relation to the BBC, in line with the kind of charter and framework agreement, there is something called a BBC First process. So it's necessary for audiences, if they want to complain about something on the BBC, to go first to the BBC, and it goes through various stages. And if they're not happy with the outcome of that, they can come to Ofcom. So we would encourage people, particularly in relation to the BBC, to do that. There are some exceptions to that. So where it deals with difficult issues like privacy, for example, it is possible for an audience person or a consumer to come to us directly and say, I want you to look at this now because I think it's so important. But it is an area where we're dealing with kind of individual complaints regularly. What we do is we publish something called the Broadcast Bulletin, and goes out roughly monthly, and it summarises everything that we've received and those things that we've either decided not to take further, and explains why we haven't taken them further, or where we have, what the process is, and then we eventually publish the decisions that map out all that's come in front of us, all the evidence that's been presented to us, and what our final decision might be.
Okay, that's great. I think that's it. All questions from this morning, so can I thank you both for your attendance this morning, and I'm going to suspend for a quick comfort break before moving into the next session. Thank you. A warm welcome back. Our next agenda item is to take evidence from the BBC, and I welcome our colleague Jackie Bailey, MSP, who's joining us for this session. We're joined in the room, and not for the first time, from Hayley Valentine, Director BBC Scotland, and Luke McCulloch, Corporate Affairs Director, Nations, BBC, and Head of Corporate Affairs from BBC Scotland, and we welcome for the first time to committee Rodri Talfin-Davies, Director of Nations, BBC Scotland. So a warm welcome to you all this morning. I'm going to invite Ms Valentine to make a short opening statement before we move to questions from our members. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you today. I understand that you want to talk about our drama investment strategy and also my priorities now that I'm 6 months into the post. As you know, I came in January when I'd only been in the post for a few weeks. First of all, let me address the decision to end River City next year, to commission only for 1 more year. It was not taken lightly, as you can imagine. None of these decisions are. It was an editorial decision based on changing viewing habits and audiences moving away from long-running dramas to high-impact, short-run drama series. And we just must deliver what the audiences want to watch. There's £9 million, as you know, currently invested in River City, and we're choosing for editorial reasons to invest that money differently. We've announced 3 new series, Councils, Grams and The Young Team, which we might talk about a bit more later, but this is just the start. So the total investment in BBC drama from Scotland is expected to rise to £95 million over the next 3 years. And that £95 million of BBC money will leverage significant third-party investment and will see Scotland and Scotland's stories increasingly represented on the global stage, as well as at home. We're expecting to deliver 6 scripted series per year across drama and comedy. That might be slightly more 1 year, slightly fewer the next, because of the way that drama schedules sometimes work. Some will be network returners. We've talked about Shetland and Vigil coming back, and some will be those new commissions like Councils, Grams and The Young Team. And to be absolutely clear, we hope that our new commissions might also become returners and enjoy that annual success. Look at Shetland, which is currently filming its 10th season as a model. When I was last before the committee in January, I was new in post, and I'm now 6 months into the role, and I'm keen to tell you a little bit more about my priorities. So I really want to build that relationship with audiences in Scotland. We're an audience-focused broadcaster. Serving audiences is core to our mission and a key factor in all the decisions that we make. I want to maximise content from Scotland, representation of Scotland for all of our audiences and all of their diversity. And it's also really important to me that we make BBC Scotland the best possible place to work. We can do that by creative, ambitious, bold, distinctive content, by seeking collaborations and partnerships with internal partners, external partners at home and across the world, and being absolutely laser-focused on the audience we're trying to reach and serve them with content that they want in the way that they want to consume it. We have to respond to our audience. When they change their habits, we need to change to meet them. And this is the context against which we make these decisions. They're not easy decisions, as I say, and we totally understand that. But in this changing and really competitive media landscape, we need to commit to creative renewal to deliver for all of our audiences. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could ask just a quick question to start off. We, Scottish Government, are absolutely committed to the Fair Work agenda and worried about precarious working practices. So how will this new direction ensure that the BBC is meeting its commitments in terms of its responsibility to employees and those involved in production?
That those fair working practices. So, we will hire people as we do now. We hire a large number of people in Scotland on permanent, staff contracts, more in the production PSB side of things. And we commission content from the external market, from the independent sector, and we expect them to comply with those fair working practices too. So none of the changes in the way that we're moving in the direction we're going in will change the way in which we operate and our commitment to fair working practices.
Thank you. I'm going to move to members' questions from the committee. I'll bring in Mr Bibby first and then Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Obviously, I've said before, it's not for politicians to make editorial decisions, either at a UK or a Scottish level, but we do have questions around, I think, value for money, about the BBC meeting its objectives, about fair work, and ensuring Scotland's TV film sector is properly invested in. On the issue of value for money, you mentioned River City has an annual budget of £9 million. I understand £1 million of this goes back into BBC Scotland as charges for the production, being on the site and using the studios. It produces 66 30-minute episodes per year, with the remaining £8 million, which works out at around £122,000 per 30-minute episode. All of this is spent in Scotland, obviously. River City, therefore, is costs significantly less to produce than the vast majority of TV dramas. Is that correct?
Certainly the cost of drama is going up, so the kind of high-impact drama that we're talking about will be more expensive than that, yes. However, it will reach much bigger audiences. You know, the decision around River City, and you know, I didn't take this lightly, and I did think about the consequences for cast, for crew, for people who are impacted by the decision. Of course I did. However, we have to put our audience needs first, and the audience for River City has declined significantly over the past 5 years, which means that the cost per viewer is much higher than it was, and the cost of producing the show has gone up. And as you will know, we reduced the number of episodes because we couldn't make the number of episodes for the budget. What we'll do with these new dramas is that they absolutely will cost more to make, but we'd expect them to deliver much bigger audiences than River City does. So in terms of value for money for the audience, I'm afraid that River City didn't pass that test for us any longer, and the new dramas we really hope will. And we know that from the dramas that we currently make, you know, for example, let's start with something like Shetland. It delivers an audience of about 700,000 in Scotland, about 7-8 million across the UK. River City is delivering 200,000. Granite Harbour is delivering 500,000. You know, the programmes like Rebus, like the other dramas that we make, are delivering much higher numbers, so therefore they're more value for money for our audience.
In terms of the actual number of hours produced, though, River City, 66 episodes, half-an-hour episodes a year, is 33 hours. My understanding is the 3 new shows, Graham's, Councils and the Young Team, will produce only 18 hours of television. So it's significantly less cost for River City, but there's also significantly more content, 15 fewer hours compared to what's currently provided by River City.
That's true. I mean, it actually is going to be 20 hours across the 3 new things initially. 8 episodes of Councils, 6, as you say, of the other 2 that we've announced. A couple of things. You know, I don't think that our audience judges us on volume. I just don't think they do. They don't go to the iPlayer and say there's not enough stuff. They judge us on quality. They judge us on coming because it's something that they want to watch. So the argument that we should make more hours of content that the audience is not consuming in large numbers just doesn't really stack up. We know that we need to make content that will make the audience think that we are value for money, that the licence fee is value for money. So if we go down to 20 hours of these new dramas, and as I say, they are not the end of the story, they're the beginning of the story. We have more coming down the track. This is a massive investment in drama in Scotland. We'll increase the amount of money the BBC puts in. We'll also, as I say, get third-party investment. I don't think that volume is the measure that we're looking at primarily. We're looking at value for money for audiences and, crucially, what they want to watch.
I think volume is an issue. Obviously, I agree with you, quality is an issue as well, and I think River City is a quality product. It's won the Royal Television Society Scotland Awards in 2023. I actually think part of the problem we have here, and we've heard from Cast and the Union last week, was the BBC have actually not done enough to market the programme, and they've moved around different slots. There's not been enough trailing of episodes. Do you not think actually the BBC have got a good product here that you could actually do more to sell? And, you know, linear television viewing figures are declining more generally, but in terms of River City, ensuring that it is getting the support and the marketing it needs.
Look, you know, I'm not disputing that River City is a quality product. I like it. It's just based on, you know, I don't make programmes for me, I make programmes for the audience. In terms of that marketing piece, I mean, River City, before we had the channel, was on BBC One only, and, you know, was occasionally moved around the schedule. When we launched the channel, we were able to put River City where it currently is, which is twice a week in a fixed slot on the channel that doesn't move, and twice a week on BBC One, alternate nights, so Monday, Wednesday and Tuesday, Thursday. So there was it does occasionally, because of, I don't know, live news events, get moved around on BBC One, but not terribly often. We also drop it on iPlayer on a Monday morning at 6 o'clock, so increasingly, as we've heard, audiences are consuming our content digitally, and it's available for them there as well. We also, and I might let Luke pick up on this because it's his department and more than mine that looks at this, but we do promote River City. It has 3 dedicated social media feeds for fans. No other programme has that. We promote it around new series when it's coming back. We promote it around storylines. We promote it around cliffhangers. We give it promotion like we do our other products. So it's not that we've been ignoring River City and that's why the audience isn't watching it. The audience has every opportunity to see it. It is in a fixed slot on 2 channels. It's on BBC One as well as the channel, and I do think that we promote it.
It does also come up on people's recommendations on iPlayer, so if people have watched one drama from Scotland, the iPlayer algorithm will recommend them River City. They're just not watching it when they find it. And as Hayley said, we do have 3 different social media accounts to support the programme. No other BBC Scotland drama has ever had that support, and those accounts exist both when the programme is on air and when it's off. So when it's taking its breaks, those social media accounts are still engaging with fans of the programme and trying to keep them interested. I'm not sure what more we could have done.
I'm not sure from my experience I've necessarily seen as much of the marketing as has been suggested, but in terms of your point there, Ms Valentine, about you don't just make programmes for you make it for the audience. You'll be aware, obviously, the BBC Charter talks about the need to reflect, represent and serve the diverse communities of the UK's nations and regions, and doing support the creative economy across the UK. Ofcom, we just heard about the need for the BBC to do more in terms of engaging with working class audiences. How does scrapping a working class drama in working class voices help build support and audience reach for working class people?
So we're really aware of the challenge, both in terms of lower socio-economic groups consuming the BBC and indeed younger people. And it's something we think about in our commissioning decisions all the time. As I say, we're here to make programmes that people want to watch. We're here to make sure that the universality of the BBC applies to everyone. If you look at the new dramas that we have commissioned, one of them is set in Springburn. It's about a working class community. It's a comic thriller. It features working class characters. One that written by a writer who's based in Springburn, has been his whole life. One of them is about knife crime and gangs and the kind of friendships and agency and hope that comes from those experiences, also set in the west of Scotland, set in North Lanarkshire. The third one is Councils, which is about young lawyers making their way in the scene in Glasgow. And, education's free in Scotland. Anyone can be a lawyer. There will be working class characters in all of these dramas. We are absolutely aware that we need to make programmes for all of our audiences.
Can I, if I may, just add to that? I think that I think this categorisation of soap operas as for working class audiences isn't evidenced by the data. I mean, soap operas can draw audiences from all sorts of backgrounds. I'd also make the point with the dramas that Hayley's already mentioned, whether it's Granite Harbour or Vigil or Shetland, they all attract significantly more working class audiences than River City do. It's true that River City has a more working class skew in terms of the audience it attracts, but it's a much, much smaller audience. So I think we need to be careful that we don't just see soap operas as a vehicle for so-called working class audiences. A lot of our drama portfolio works harder in reaching working class audiences than River City is able to do. It's not a criticism of River City, it's a reflection that soap operas generally have really been squeezed by changing audience behaviour.
I accept that people will watch different people watch different programmes, but this is a soap about a working class community and working class voices, and I think I very much welcome more investment in production in Scotland in different ways, but I think I find it hard to see how it's going to replicate what is currently there with River City. In terms of the Fair Work agenda, you mentioned, Ms Valentine, earlier, but making sure the BBC was the best possible place to work. There's been a lot of anger from the casting crew about the decision, but particularly about the BBC decisions around ending River City. You mentioned earlier it was an editorial decision, but casting crew were told that there was no option to renew the lease for the site, and that was instrumental in ending River City.
An editorial decision. Clearly we had a lease at Dumbarton, but this was it's a distraction. It was absolutely an editorial decision. But Luke, do you want to pick up on the detail?
Yeah, the cast and crew were told in person by BBC Scotland's Louise Thornton, our head of commissioning, who has appeared at this committee before, that it was very important that BBC Scotland themselves joined the cast and crew to share that decision. It's not always been the case when programmes have been decommissioned by the BBC that the BBC has talked with the cast and crew, but we were really clear that that was the right thing to do. And Louise did explain her decision. And right at the top of what she said a decision was about changing audience habits. And that is exactly what Hayley has said. Was the lease mentioned in that meeting? Quite probably. I wasn't in it. But there is no viable option for us to extend that lease for a bucket load of reasons, which are commercial between the BBC and the landlord. The reason mainly the lease was mentioned in the meeting is about the timing. We didn't choose to end River City now. There was no more River City commissioned at all at the point when we decided what was happening with it. But we decided to run for an additional year, and that would tie in with the end of the lease. The lease ends next year, and that is the relevance of why we said that to the cast.
I think the other point just to make is that the BBC is a big organisation. We are regularly dealing with lots of very big ticket commissions. Had we wanted to continue the series, we could have sorted the issue. You can relocate, you can discuss it with the current landlord. There are ways of making the drama work. But it comes back to what Hayley said right at the outset. The first decision is, do we want to continue or do we want to pursue other projects? And the decision in this case was that we saw other projects that we thought we should invest in creatively.
The cast and crew weren't just told the lease was coming to an end. They were told it was coming to an end and there was no option to renew the lease. That's very different.
I don't think we can get into commercial discussions between the BBC and the landlord, but we're pretty clear there is no...
I'm talking about discussions between the cast and the BBC.
We're pretty clear there is no viable option for us to extend the lease at the moment. There are issues on the site. The cast are aware of them because we wrote to them last year to explain, for example, the presence of RAC on the site. The BBC would not renew leases on sites with RAC. There is no viable option for us in that site at the moment. But as Roger Telfin-Davis has just said, had the BBC wished to continue making River City, if it was the right thing for the audience, if it was attracting more than it is, we would have found a way of making it.
My colleague Jackie Bailey contacted the owner of the site, who confirmed that they were surprised by the BBC's decision to end the lease. The cast were told there was no option to renew the lease. Why were they told something that was categorically untrue?
There is no viable option for the BBC to renew that lease in the state of the site at the moment. But I can't go further than that because it's a commercial discussion between the BBC and the landlord. The landlord hasn't come to us and said that anything we have said is out of line with discussions that they have had with the BBC. I'm confident that there was no viable option to renew the lease. But I would stress again, the reason to end River City had nothing to do with the lease. The timing of when we draw it to a close absolutely ties in with the end of the lease. But the reason that we have ended River City is because on average it is getting 200,000 people per episode watching it, when every other BBC Scotland drama we make gets more than double that figure as a minimum.
Well, yep.
We'll come back to you if we've got more time. But
Sure.
Mr Adam, you wanted in a supplementary, is that right?
Couple, if that's okay. Basically, good morning for a start. Basically, it'll be no shock to you in particular, Luke, that I welcome the £65 million in drama over the next 3 years, right? But why can't we have a situation where we can have both? Because there is no way you're going to replace a long-term serialised drama with 6 episodes of 3 shows. You know, you're just not. It's not going to say the level of work, the guarantee of the work. We heard that from various members of the cast, you know, and technical staff. You're not going to create that new technical staff and give off first opportunities to writers, actors. You know, it's just not going to have the same effect. And yes, television's changing, but we're not having this conversation about EastEnders, and its ratings have tanked over the time. So, you know, why does it always seem to be that here in Scotland we're the ones? Why can't we have both? Because I don't think they'll be having that conversation down in the BBC in London.
I mean, I sat here in January and made it clear that, you know, for everything that we wanted to do that was new, we had to stop doing something. We know what the situation is with the finances in the BBC, and I don't have the money to do everything that I want to. I mean, there are a million things that I'd like to do that aren't possible. So I have to make difficult decisions. And this decision, as I say, was made on the basis that the audience figures are not performing for us in the way that we need them to. That it's not going to be exactly the same. As I say, fewer episodes, short-run dramas. It's what the audience is asking us to do. It's what the audience is showing us that they want us to do. You know, the EastEnders question is a slightly different one. Obviously, it's made for a UK audience. Its audiences actually aren't tanking. It's slightly defying gravity at the moment.
That it was back in the day.
Well,
it's got the exact same challenges as a show like River City, that people are watching it in different ways. You can't necessarily judge the show on the live actual figures you're getting there. There'll be more iPlayer and everything else as well.
Indeed, but you know, EastEnders does significantly better in Scotland than River City does, both on iPlayer and live. It does better among younger audience than River City does. It does better in terms of geographic reach than River City does. So we took all this into consideration. Of course we did. And on that point about
so
accessing...
Does that, sorry to interrupt, but does that not kind of give you an example that there is a market for a serialised soap opera like that in Scotland? Maybe relaunching River City might be the idea rather than...
Look, we looked at all the options. I'm afraid we have changed the format of River City in terms of number of episodes per week. We've changed where it's on. We've given the audience the opportunity to access it on iPlayer. I'm afraid it just hasn't worked. You know, it's had a really good run. When it finishes, it'll be 24 years old. That's longer than most of these long-running series last for. So, you know, we have given it a really good run, but I do think it's time to do other things. And on the point around, you know, access, you know, to these, you know, first jobs for people, access to the training, etc. There will be that on these new dramas. I mean, there will be a wider range of them, and there'll be more of a geographic mix, so perhaps access to people around different parts of the country, although, you know, intentionally these three dramas are based in the same sort of geography as River City is. But we need to think about making new products that I think the audience wants more of. And we will, you know, River City is not the only game in town in terms of access to drama in Scotland, whether you are an actor, whether you're a director, whether you're a producer, whether you're a trainee. We offer these opportunities across a really wide range of content. It's not just River City that does that for us.
No, I agree with that. And I did say right at the start, I welcome the investment. But I'm making the argument that anywhere else in the UK, the argument would simply be that, you know, you can have both, you know, and you can make a way to make it work. I just find it difficult that we seem to be, here in Scotland, the ones that have to make the sacrifices, where elsewhere in the BBC, they're the ones that are just carrying on business as usual.
I'm going to let you come in 1 minute. There's one other thing to say about this. This is not a sacrifice. We are reinvesting all of this money in Scotland. We are getting additional funding from Network, and hopefully, and I know for a fact in terms of the things we've already announced, additional funding from third parties. This is an increase in the investment. I want to see more money spent on screen in Scotland, not less. And just one final thing, I'm going to hand to Roger, you can do the UK picture and you can please talk about EastEnders on my behalf. However, the thing about the kind of, you mentioned the long-term, you know, job for life thing, the vast majority of the cast on River City are not on long-term contracts. They are contracted year to year. We've only ever commissioned it 12 months at a time. I think there was once during COVID that we commissioned it for a little bit longer for very sort of specific reasons, but we only commission a series at a time. And the vast majority of people who work on that show have short-term contracts. Like most people that work in this area of the industry, whether they're actors, directors, producers, I don't think you go into it thinking you're going to work on the same project for life.
12 months is still a better deal than
but can I just clarify?
6 episodes.
Almost all of them are not on 12-month contracts. They're on 12-week contracts. It films for 12 weeks, and then they go off and make other stuff. They'll appear in pantomime with their actors. The contracts for the vast majority of people are very, very short. They'll get a 12-week contract to do the work and off. River City films in 2 12-week blocks, whereas something like Shetland is currently filming for 6 months. So there is longevity in a lot of these products that maybe isn't in some of the sort of churn of a soap opera.
I'll make it very quickly. I mean, the first point is to reiterate, this is a strategy to increase investment and opportunity in drama and comedy in Scotland. It is not about a reduction. So this idea that something is being done to Scotland, this is about a creative opportunity and it's about growth. To the point about, is River City being picked on? There is a challenge across all soap operas in the UK. Now, it is true that EastEnders is one of the big beasts. Its audience in Scotland is 20-30% higher than River City. But we have seen the end of Doctors, which was being broadcast and produced in the West Midlands. We have seen the end of Holby City, that was being filmed in Elstree in London. This is a pattern that reflects a changing audience habit.
We're going to come back to Mr. Stewart and then I'll take
Thank you. Can I move on to touch on Scottish production at the moment and ask you some questions with that. Now, the change in approach to commissioning acknowledges that the BBC has, and there's a view that across at least the last 10 years there has been under-delivery for Scotland, and that's an opinion that people have. So can I ask what resources you are offering the Commission, and will the BBC now look at Scotland's production companies, their writers, their directors, their crews, to ensure that the corporation's obligations for Scottish production is and continues to be met and achieved?
So, I don't quite recognise the kind of under-delivering that you mentioned, in that, we exceed our quotas for network production made in Scotland, and as you know, we have our own, Scottish budget, so we spend a lot of money on co-productions with network, which we commission and deliver for both Scottish audiences and broader audiences. And we spend a lot of money on programmes that are specifically for Scottish audiences. And particularly since the launch of the channel, we got a big investment, at that stage. And I think we've been making a lot more content, which is reflecting the lives of people in Scotland back to themselves and out to broader audiences. And that's really what I want to expand on. I want more of our money to be spent on portrayal, on representation of all of Scotland, and I want that for Scottish audiences to see themselves reflected back, and then that, the Scottish story to be told more widely. I want it to be told across the UK and beyond that. So, I don't think that we're under-delivering, but don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely ambitious for more. The second half of your question, can you repeat that again?
It was about ensuring that you look first at the Scottish production companies,
yes,
and their crew and their writers and directors to make sure that they get the opportunities.
The vast majority of the commissions that we've made in the last year, I think 90% have been Scottish companies based here that do the work. And if you just look at these examples of the dramas that we have commissioned, the vast majority of the talent that we will hire, the production talent, the on-screen talent, the writers are all Scottish. Our ambition is that this is absolutely about growing the industry in Scotland and growing the sense that you can be in Scotland and make world-class content. And so I don't recognise the under-delivering, but we are absolutely committed to growing the industry in Scotland so that there's a brilliant creative sector, that there's a brilliant opportunities if you work here, that we grow the economy through that, and we grow the quality of content that we make, as I say, so that Scotland feels like the BBC is absolutely delivering for them. You probably want to pick up on this, though.
Well, I think you covered everything. Okay. I mean, I think this. I mean, just a challenge on the under-delivery. This is the BBC is an organisation that invests the best part of £300 million a year in Scotland, and just to put that into some sort of context, that is 3 times more than Channel 4, Channel 5, ITV, and STV combined. So this is an extraordinary level of investment into Scotland. The point of the changes that we announced last week is we think we can go further, and we can give you more assurance, and we can give the sector more assurance that our priority is that all our big network productions deliver in terms of employing and using local talent across Scotland, and also spending the vast majority of their productions budget here in Scotland. So it is about going further, and as you heard from Ofcom earlier, this is a level of, this is a standard that we want to set that goes beyond the current Ofcom rules. And we think it's the right thing for the BBC to do, to give everybody confidence that our intent is very clear and our ambition is underlined.
It's good to note that you have that aspiration and that ambition for where we are. And can I ask about the Commissioners and how they are tasked with providing and selecting new projects for Scotland itself? How that goes about, and do they meet with drama, culture, comedy, entertainment? How do they actually select and choose what will be the next opportunities? Because that's what you've talked about today. You're changing some of the structures, you're adapting, you want to see different aspects coming into the sector and opportunities. So how are these managed to ensure that you do capture the comedy, the drama, the entertainment, the general fiscal and the way of things managed for Scotland, to ensure that these productions and these opportunities are grasped and they are kept here and managed effectively for Scotland to flourish because that would be our ambition, and obviously your ambition to achieve that for the corporation, and to see where BBC Scotland can go in the future, even with the demands that you have on financial resources and tasking to ensure that you can manage that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're asking for a completely sort of technical answer, but I would say, you know, we have 14 commissioners based in Scotland, a combination of commissioners who work directly for me, commissioners who work for Network, you know, looking for Scottish ideas that we can co-commission together, for example, things like Shetland, and commissioners who work for our Gaelic services. And, you know, you'll all know already the massive success we've had with that kind of the first high-impact Gaelic drama, you know, 1.8 million iPlayer views of that drama so far. You know, it's absolutely mainstream and winning awards left, right and centre. So, you know, our commissioners are, you know, on the ground. They are here in Scotland. They are talking to the sector all of the time. And when we have a strategic briefing this afternoon with, I think, 80-odd people coming into Pacific Key to talk to us about our strategic priorities, it's not a commissioning briefing as such, but it's the strategic priorities, so that they absolutely know the direction of travel, what our priorities are, what the broader BBC is thinking, which is, you know, why Rodri is part of that briefing this afternoon, what BBC Scotland's priorities are. And you know, we put out specific commissioning briefs. As I say, I don't think you're looking at the, sort of, the technicalities of exactly how it all works, but we are not short of good ideas in Scotland. We know the sector, we know the individuals, we know the companies. We do a lot to grow smaller Scottish companies. You know, we have a small indie fund, which I think currently is supporting, you know, 4 companies on specific projects, but also we work with the bigger companies, we work with the full range. And, you know, people send us ideas all of the time. As you can imagine, you know, more ideas than money is always a mixed place to be. But we also put out specific commissioning briefs. You know, we mentioned earlier we have issues around, you know, younger audiences. So we will put out specific briefs saying we're looking for ideas that will try to attract that audience and ways in which we can reach certain audiences. We look for gaps in what we're doing, as well as building on success stories. So we have really close relationships in Scotland. It's a really close community. And as I say, we really benefit from having all of those commissioners on the ground who know what Scottish audiences want, who are absolutely across the data, but are also looking for something we've never done before.
I think, if I may, since Hayley's arrived as director, I think the conversation that she has driven around how, firstly, how we ensure the money spent in Scotland really works for Scotland, Scottish talent, but also this creative ambition. Now, part of that creative ambition is things like securing the men's internationals and putting, you know, the footy back on the Beeb, which has been a huge win in Scotland. But part of it is actually how BBC Scotland and the BBC Network teams come together to drive, we were talking about it with Ofcom, authentic portrayal of Scotland. And what we've done under Hayley's leadership is really create a framework for that, which will mean that at least 30–40% of network expenditure in Scotland in the coming years will deliver genuine, authentic portrayal. And I think that's really important. The investment numbers are good, and we've made real progress, but we want to demonstrate, and I know Hayley's ambitious to demonstrate, we can really deliver creatively too in terms of reflecting Scotland on the screen.
Thank you, Camille.
Harvey?
Sorry, not sorry. I am going to come back to River City for a couple of questions first of all, but then I'll move on to the recent announcement on regional production. You've said very clearly that this was an editorial decision, and I accept that that was the motivating factor. But one of the things that has left a bad taste in the mouth for the people who received that distressing news was they have the very strong perception that they were misinformed, that the landlord wanted to sell the site for housing. And I really would welcome it if we can just tie that off and put that issue to rest. Can you confirm where the team at River City told that? And if they weren't told that, how has the perception arisen that they were misled?
This one up.
So, again, I don't know exactly what was said in that meeting, but what I do know is I was on the set of River City about 3 weeks before we announced the decommissioning of it. And while I was there, about 3 people said to me, "Have you heard the landlord wants to sell the place when the lease ends and build houses on it?" And I said, "I hadn't heard that, actually." But it was very much being spoken about openly in and around the set. So if our commissioners were asked about that, if they were asked to speculate, I don't doubt they reflected that speculation back. But I have no clear intention that or information that the landlord wants to sell the land for housing. And as Mr Bibby mentioned earlier, the landlord has said that he, in fact, would have been quite happy to extend the lease.
So are you saying the BBC was not the source of that perception?
As I said, 3 weeks before that, I was asked myself by 3 people on the set that. So I don't know what the source of that perception was.
I'm not asking if you personally were responsible for where that
I was
suggestion
absolutely
came from.
personally
was the
not.
BBC responsible for that?
I think that was already being discussed well before the commissioning briefing, because I experienced that myself. So I don't believe the BBC was the source of that, because 3 weeks prior to it, it was being openly discussed.
Yeah, it still feels as though there's quite a lot of confusion about where that came from, and I think that's extremely unfortunate in the way this has been handled. I think if there's any suggestion that anybody at River City was told something that wasn't true by the BBC, you should be investigating that very seriously. Can I move on to the impact of the decision, though? Hayley Valentine very clearly set out that there's an issue about making sure that the BBC is producing output that people want to watch. And I think even the folk at River City understand that there are changing tastes. They're not kind of got their head in the sand. But there's another thing that the BBC needs to do beyond producing content people want to watch. The BBC needs to also create the ecosystem for the industry. Training opportunities, first job opportunities, on a scale that justifies. It's one of the reasons I think there should be a broadcaster like the BBC, a large, dominant, publicly funded broadcaster, is to create that ecosystem, because nobody else is going to do it. Would you confirm that you don't expect the new 6 and 8 part productions to create the same level and scale of career opportunities, training opportunities that River City has? And how do you intend to replace that for the longer term, so that the BBC is making that permanent, ongoing investment in opportunities that mean in 10, 20, 30 years we're going to have an increasing and diverse cohort of folk working in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, can I start by saying, this is a really, really good challenge, because the work that River City has done, particularly around that training, has been exemplary. Yes. And, it is something that we thought long and hard about in terms of what would that look like going forward in a very different ecosystem than the one that doesn't have a long-running drama, in the mix. So, the broader thing to say really is that the BBC does provide a lot of training opportunities that are not connected to River City. That's not the only game in town. We do a lot of training across our existing projects, some of which I've mentioned today. At the moment, I think there are 50-odd apprenticeships in the BBC. I think when I last came, there were 60. It's because there's a bit of flux because some have graduated and the new ones start in September. But we support a lot of training in the BBC across all of our projects. It's something that is built into most of the work that we do. And as I say, the apprenticeships are, a really big part of what we do. And in terms of that diversity piece, I think that, River City has brought people in from a wide range of backgrounds that we've talked about. We monitor all of our training across our own diversity targets. The BBC is, world leading in terms of diversity targets across the piece, and we will continue to do that, particularly around the socio-economic targets, because we know that that's where, River City has done some really, really good work. Yeah. So we are building. I don't have all of the details for you today. You won't be surprised to hear, because these projects they're not up and running yet. But we are building a framework around all of the new projects where we will put training in place across all of them. None of this is like for like. We talked about the number of hours, we're talking about the training. None of it is exactly like for like, of course not. But we are absolutely committed to quality opportunities to bring people into the industry. Whether it's bringing in people that is their first role on or off screen, whether it's bringing in people that are kind of mid-level, shadow directing in a project that is bigger than they might have worked on before. And the truth is, we need the training, like the work itself, to match the way the industry is going. So training a high number of people to work on soap operas only is not delivering for us into the future. It's not delivering for the trainees. So having that opportunity to have a project like this, a high-impact drama on your CV that you've worked on as a trainee at the bottom level, or your first role, or mid-career, is probably more valuable in the end.
Sure.
I'm not going to say that I know it's going to be exactly like for like, either in terms of volume or in terms of, across the year, whatever. But I am going to say that we are really working hard on this, and I'd be happy to come back in the autumn or whenever I'm next asked, when we should have more detail, because some of these projects will be up and running by then.
I appreciate that it's not always going to be a like-for-like replacement, but I think there's going to be a strong expectation from this committee and from others that you are able to demonstrate that what's being created afresh is going to be at least as valuable in terms of those new opportunities as what you've decided to close.
Yeah. And I'm really happy to take that challenge. As I say, I don't have all the facts and figures yet, because we're working on that framework. One of the projects starts in August, one starts in February, one starts later next year. We are working on this. As we develop the projects, we haven't cast these shows yet. We haven't crewed these shows yet, but we are absolutely committed to that training. And I would like there to be, more working class development in BBC Scotland, not less, as a result of this.
Can I move on then to the announcement recently about qualifying criteria for regional production? And I think there has been a broad welcome for this. Can I ask you, though, whether you would accept that it is, in a sense, an admission that the situation has been not always wholly honest in the past? For example, there's a report from Screen Scotland last year showed that of the top 5, in inverted commas, Scottish producers by Hours commissioned, only 5 were based in Scotland. 2/3 of them were headquartered in London. And of those top 15, only 2 of the 11 suppliers mainly used by the BBC in that list were companies formed and headquartered in Scotland. Is it fair to say that the way these issues have been handled in the past has failed to create the level of benefit and investment into a broadcasting and production ecosystem in Scotland that could have been done, and that we therefore have to catch up a bit, and that's really why these changes are long overdue?
You won't be surprised that that's probably not how I see things. I think what their admission of is that we can do even better than we're doing today, and that we can give even more clarity about our commitment to drive expenditure in the local economy and to drive expenditure with local skills and craft. So, we have been consistently above our target for network expenditure in Scotland for many years. As I say, we make a £300 million investment every year in Scotland. But I think when we were looking at the Ofcom criteria, which we follow along with all the other public service broadcasters in the UK, our view, and it's a conversation obviously that Hayley and I have had over many months, is we could do even better. And we could do even better by making sure that in future, when we look at fresh network commissions, our expectation is that every production will meet at least 2 of the 3 Ofcom criteria, and that a qualification on base only, which is allowed under the Ofcom rules, is not where the BBC wants to land. So, this regulatory structure has evolved. Ofcom has its view on how it wants to set it out, and they are our regulator. But our view is we can do even better.
Can I just pick up on that? To your original question around those numbers. I think it's very easy to do, but I think we are conflating 2 things. We talked about, with the O&O report, the Screen Scotland report, Scottish headquarters. We welcome working with companies who are based in Scotland, who are committed to growth in Scotland, who want to tell Scotland's stories. Of course, we're keen to promote companies which have, are Scottish root and branch. Of course we are. And as I say, things like the Small Indie Fund demonstrates that we want to grow those businesses. But what we're really after is the best ideas. And, we are not going to, discriminate against companies because they have a headquarters elsewhere. If you're highly successful and you're bought out for whatever reason, because you need or want to be, by a company with a headquarters elsewhere, wherever that might be, that doesn't change our relationship with you.
I get the point, absolutely. But isn't this part of what the BBC's purpose and value is to shape that landscape? Not just to say we want to get the best ideas, so we'll go to a company that's based in London to do it. But to say we want the best ideas to be coming from companies based here, and that's what you have the opportunity to grow. So do you expect, as a result of these changes, those numbers to be reversed, for example?
Well,
that,
I mean,
that two-thirds will be based here, and very occasionally you'll
this
use
is what I mean
one
about
based in London.
conflating the issues. We're not talking about things that are made here. You know, by that definition, River City has a London headquarters. Shetland has a London headquarters. Landward has a London headquarters. Debate Night has a London headquarters. I think we all know that those are properly Scottish projects that are made here for audiences in Scotland that are highly successful. I absolutely want our content to be made here. I want people to have successful, ambitious careers here, not have to go elsewhere to find success. Of course, that's what I want. All I'm saying is that I don't think that the fact that you have, you know, you're part of a bigger company elsewhere for whatever reason. For many good, you know, we know that the industry is precarious. Many good reasons why you might accept an offer to be bought by a bigger multinational or UK-based company. That doesn't mean that the work that you do for us is less valuable.
But you do expect these numbers to change to some extent as a result of the decision that was announced last week?
As a result of the changes that we've announced, we would expect, we only have a small handful of productions that don't already qualify on 2 of the Ofcom criteria in Scotland. We would expect that number to get even smaller. And that will mean that more money is being spent on the ground in Scotland, and it will mean that more professionals in the industry in Scotland are employed on those productions.
Okay, so it's a more modest change, perhaps.
Well, it's not about ownership structures of the indies. It's about opportunity on the ground and spend on the ground.
Okay.
And it's really important. It goes back to something you heard from Ofcom earlier. It's really, I mean, my view is it's really important you don't disincentivise other organisations from wanting to do business in Scotland. The key thing for the sector is a mixed ecology of companies and that there's genuine opportunity. I think ownership structures are a distraction from the successful growth of the sector.
I think I could probably go further on that point for quite some time, but I'm aware of time. I think we will have to come back to that as we see the effect of this decision.
Yep. Thank you, Mr Harvey, and thank you. We are very, very tight for time. I still have 3 members to come in and possibly back to Mr Bibby as well. Mr Kerr.
Yeah. Time, you're absolutely right. So let me just get to the point. The BBC Charter renewal. Obviously, you've already begun a consultation, your own consultation, not the government-sponsored one. Our BBC, Our Future. What are you doing to engage with the viewers in Scotland specifically to get their direct feedback as part of the consultation?
Can I start? Are you want to go?
No, you go.
I mean, the consultation is across the UK, as you know. There are, you know, you may have seen that we have specific adverts going out in Scotland with Scottish talent on them to attract people to that consultation. But the consultation is going out to audiences in Scotland in exactly the same way as it's going to audiences across the UK. We'll receive that information. I think I said in January we will, you know, we'll be led by what the audience tells us.
How will you measure the success of the engagement that you plan in Scotland?
I mean, you know, we look at what people tell us. You know,
no, I mean in terms of reach.
Well, you know, we hope as many people as possible engage with this. You know, it's being pushed out there. You know, I don't know whether any of you have received this, but it's being pushed out there. You know, somebody said to me recently, "Oh, you know, Tim Davie wrote to me." Very nice. But we are writing to a lot of people, asking them to engage with us. And we hope as many people as possible do. As I say, there's a universality issue around the BBC, and we hope that we get as much response as possible, so that our decision making can be based on, you know, the largest number of voices.
Sure.
Last time we undertook an engagement during the last charter process. The audience or the public response, written responses in Scotland was around 5,000 to 10,000. I think we'll easily surpass that this time. But alongside it, we will do representative research so that we also get the fullest possible picture in Scotland.
Part of the Charter renewal, obviously, is funding, the model by which the BBC is funded. Currently, there are rising numbers of people who are not paying their TV licence. This looks like it is exponentially increasing, in fact, particularly among some demographics, younger people in particular. What's the BBC's response to that? And do you expect funding to be a crucial part of the review of the Charter?
Should I take that? I mean, 2 things. Just on the point, there isn't exponential growth in innovation or unwillingness to pay the licence fee. In fact, last year we saw the rate of decline slow, which, you know, you're still losing some people, but that rate of decline has slowed, and we have significantly more than 20 million households in the UK paying the licence fee.
Look, but that number in Scotland is pretty high compared with the rest of the Kingdom, and that is
it is a little
growing.
higher in Scotland, no doubt.
And it is growing.
It is growing. It's growing
Yeah.
across the UK. What I'm
Yeah.
saying is that the rate of decline in terms of paying the licence fee it was a better picture last year than the year before. I think the question of funding is going to be a critical dimension of the Charter Review. There are three real fundamental issues. One is, how do we protect the independence of the BBC? The second is to ensure that we have a sustainable funding model. And we're pretty open-minded about that. And clearly there will be engagement with the UK government on that, but also discussions, no doubt, with this place and with the Scottish government. What is essential is whether we believe as a society that a continued large-scale public intervention in the media space is the right thing for this country and for these four nations. That is the starting point. If we believe that, then I believe the right funding solution will follow that. But I think that actually the case for the BBC, whether it's misinformation, as you were discussing with Ofcom, whether it's about supporting creativity across the whole UK, whether it's that communality of bringing people together, I think the case is very, very strong, and we will be making it obviously as strongly as possible. And we'll also be looking for support across the sector and across all four nations. But funding will be critical. We've lost the best part of £1 billion in real terms over the last 10, 12 years. We are in an incredibly competitive landscape against very, very well-resourced global competitors. It is critical we get the right funding settlement.
There's so many aspects of this that it would almost take a session in its own right, and I don't have the time, unfortunately, because I'd also like to have asked you about how you're engaging with younger audiences, because again, I think the BBC acknowledges it's losing the under-35s.
If you cross all the public service broadcasters, it is the biggest strategic challenge. Their viewing habits are different.
Yeah.
Their use of services like YouTube are growing each year. If public service broadcasting is to thrive in the next decade, we have to address that head on.
Can I take that up as well, just very briefly? And the kind of how we're engaging for Charter is one thing. How we're engaging, the truth is that all of this comes down to what content we make and how we push it out to people and how they receive it. And we are acutely aware of the young people challenge, particularly in Scotland. We were talking about commissioning briefs earlier. One of the commissioning briefs we put out a couple of years ago was around younger audiences in particular. We made a programme called The Agency, which you may or may not have watched. That's okay. It was, and interestingly, it didn't do massively well on linear television. It was designed for younger female, slightly, normal young women.
Not
basically.
my demographic.
Probably not your demographic. We put it out on linear, it did nothing. We put it on iPlayer, it went through the roof. We're now on series 2 or 3, and we won a BAFTA for it last year. So, we are absolutely thinking about how do we attract younger audiences, and once we've got them, how do we keep them? I mean, but part of the earlier session, we talked about misinformation. We're thinking about how we deliver our news. I mean, we deliver our news in lots of different ways. As you know, we've just changed the way that we deliver our news. We've changed our funding model so that we can launch new products. We've just launched vertical video on news because we know that that's how young people receive their news. So this is a constant conversation. So we can talk about making the case for the BBC, making the case for younger audiences, but it is my strong belief that the biggest piece of work we do is on screen, on air, on radio, on digital. We attract those audiences by making the right content for them.
Right content is a good lead to my last question, mindful of time. Very quick, yeah. And that is the launch of Scotcast.
Yes.
Because since you last were with us, and I know you're new in your role, relatively speaking still, you launched Scotcast. What have you learned about news content as a podcast? What can you transfer to an improved coverage of the Scottish Parliament? Which you would expect me to mention.
Least surprising question today.
Least surprising.
Scotcast has been a really interesting project. I'm really proud of it. I really like the tone, the style. Again, it's just that it's doing very serious subjects, but in a slightly more informal way. And ideally, it's attracting a different audience. I mean, it's still new. 4 or 5 months into a project is still pretty new. One of the interesting things that we've learned, and we should know this, but again, I'm not 25, is that people want to watch podcasts more than they want to listen to them. And actually, we get really big numbers through watching it. So, we've invested heavily in visualisation in a number of our studios around Scotland. Inverness, Edinburgh's being kitted out in the next couple of months. A couple of studios in Glasgow. We're making a bespoke podcast studio.
What about here?
Because we know
what
that...
about here?
upstairs, we're looking at it. This is, I mean, we don't have much kind of leeway in what we can do in this building because it's not ours.
It's a very short walk to the
10
BBC's Edinburgh studio.
I know it's steps up the road.
Yeah, it's around the corner.
But yeah, there's something around the informality of the tone of voice. It also allows us to do subjects in more depth. I mean, there's, the accusation around news is that we pick something and then we leave, and having that kind of, infinite, but at least kind of 20, 30, 40 minutes on a subject is just a different way of telling people about things that often we know that news is off-putting because people don't understand the terminology or the headlines. We've learned loads from it.
And that does lend scope to the coverage of the proceedings of Parliament, doesn't it?
Indeed, and I think it's done, a number
It's done a bit of that.
It's done a number of stories about the proceedings of Parliament and in some depth. And I think if you get invited onto Scotcast, I would recommend you all said yes.
Still waiting for the invitation.
I'll have a word. Because it allows
you've got some excellent journalists here. You know that. It's among your best. And it's, the product, the vehicle to deliver what's happening in this Parliament through the medium of those journalists is critically important to all of us in this committee.
Yeah, agreed.
Right.
Thank you. Mr Brown.
First question, really, I've only two, but is Rodri Talfin-Davis said that is currently spend around £300 million a year. What proportion of the licence fee raised in Scotland is that?
It's 90 odd.
About 90%.
But no more than that.
Is it?
Yes.
So it's pretty unchanged over the last 5 years, certainly.
It's increased over the last 5 years.
It's increased. 5 years ago it was in the 70s or 80s. Luke, you've got better memory for numbers than me, but it's now in 94, 95, the last ARA.
Yeah, when the annual report and accounts was first presented to the culture committees that came before this one, the BBC spent 55% of the licence fee raised in Scotland. Last year it spent about 97% of the licence fee raised in Scotland. That number's going to move. It's tied to transmission times, so it appears in our accounts in years when things are transmitted, not the year we actually spend the money. But it's moved in a remarkably positive direction, not least with the discussions that we've had in this Parliament about it.
Yeah, this committee got figures in 2021 that said it was 90% at that time. Leaving that aside, the point raised by Mr Kerr about the tail-off in Scotland, more pronounced elsewhere in the UK, of people willing to pay the licence fee. I should say I told this committee, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I just got my licence, just moved into new property. And then this week I've got a letter saying I'm being investigated for not having a licence. A strange thing, but there you go. I'm just going to venture some reasons why that might be the case, and I'd be interested in your view on it. First of all, in relation to small things, maybe seem trivial, the almost constant overruns of UK programmes which eat into programmes which people want to tune into in Scotland, usually news programmes, but I can think of a sports programme, rugby, England rugby match, women's rugby match, that stopped coverage of the early parts of the Scotland-Greece football match. That's really irritating when you're waiting for 2 or 3 minutes before some little conversation between a couple of presenters and a news programme down south. The second one is on news coverage. Now, I think you do an incredible amount of news coverage in Scotland on devolved issues. You have special investigations. You marry up your radio and TV coverage to cover issues, devolved issues absolutely exhaustively. It exhausts me, certainly, sometimes. You do that all the time. But when it comes to reserved issues, and it is the position of the BBC, there are 2 governments in Scotland, they're completely absent. I mean, I raised this on air with going right back to Gordon Brewer and latterly with Martin. And they both had the same reason. We can't get UK ministers to appear. So very important issues, such as HS2 being cut from Scotland or the overrun on aircraft carriers, they're just not covered by BBC in Scotland at all. And it seems very partial when you do that. And the third point is on sports. I mean, I mentioned earlier on, we talked to Ofcom. I've campaigned since 2007 to have the Scotland football matches deemed to be part of the crown jewels or listed events, and it's not happening. I know that's not in the gift of the BBC, but when you did eventually get a programme with a Scottish match, it was appalling. The production of it was late. You missed the early part of the proceedings. There was no commentary at all. You allowed the overrun from a previous one. And it's because it was on pitch, as you did for the Cup final on Saturday, rather than the studio-based one. So I think those things, to me, and certainly going by my mailbag, are reasons why people are losing faith in the BBC in Scotland. And I'd be interested in your views on those points.
Well, everyone we meet has something to tell us, as you can imagine. This job doesn't make me short of opinions on things that we do well or less well. On the politics point, we are absolutely committed to covering everything that impacts Scotland. So, I don't think that we are ignoring reserved issues. If they impact Scotland, of course not. And also, you know, we cover these things across the UK in our programming as well.
No, but that's not the point, covering it across the UK. It's covering it in Scotland, because there's a government active in Scotland that's impacting on Scottish people, and you don't cover it. I can give you 100 examples of things that you've not covered. Reserved issues which impact directly on people of Scotland.
Well, you know, most of our programme, we have some specific television programme which is about Scottish issues, but all of our news programme, we've expanded the number of news programmes we make. As you say, we make extensive news coverage. We've just launched News at 7, we've just launched Scotcast, 3 hours of Good Morning Scotland in the morning. The point of those programmes is to view the world through the prism of a Scottish audience, the world and the UK and Scotland, probably in reverse order. So we are absolutely committed to covering everything that impacts Scottish audiences. So, you know, if you have some specific examples, I'm really happy to take them away. But it is clearly our ambition in our news coverage to look at the world, to look at Scotland, to look at the UK and to look at the broader world through the prism of the eyes of a Scottish audience. And that's what we try to do. So, you know, as I say, I'm very happy to take some specific examples away. The other ones, I mean, you know, there will always be scheduling issues and overruns. I mean, you know, on Saturday we knocked half the schedule out to cover, you know, extra time and penalties for the cup final. That will always be the case, and not everyone is going to be happy with those decisions. But we make those decisions based on what we think are the best needs. There will always be things that overrun. You know, I think that our job to get people to pay the licence fee is to create the sort of programmes, the sort of coverage. Scotland International's case in point, I know how important football is to a Scottish audience. It was absolutely worth fighting for those, irrespective of the Crown Jewels argument, which is not mine to have. Our job is to create the best content. I don't think that people stop paying the licence fee because of things around the ages. I think that our job is to make sure that we are delivering content that they want to watch. And whether that's in the drama sector, whether that's in the sports sector, whether that's, as you say, in the news sector, you know, we are increasingly important at the moment in the world of news. I take my responsibilities in that really seriously. Those are the kind of arguments with the public that we need to win that make us feel like that we are worth paying for.
Thank you very much. And I should say for the record that I think if you have more politicians on your podcast, I'm not sure what that would do for viewing figures. But having said that, let me take
Could possibly comment.
I know. Trust in the BBC, I think, is important to parliamentarians, but it's important to us as viewers as well. So let me take you to the meeting of the 18th of March, to the River City workplace meeting, where the very clear impression was given to the staff that one of the reasons for ending the show was due to the site lease coming to an end in 2026 with no option to renew. Now, I have a recording of that meeting and I have a transcript that I'm happy to share with the committee. Gavin Smith, at 3 minutes 57, says, and I quote, "The site lease comes to an end next year without the option to renew. This is a clear obstacle and it's inevitably prompted a decision to be made." Gavin Smith, again, at 4 minutes 25, when he was speaking about the prospect of having to relocate, and I quote, "It would mean significant additional investment for rebuilds." So counting in the rebuilding of a set was part of the decision to halt River City. That would have inflated the cost and there was no need to rebuild. You could have continued on site. Asked specifically by a member of staff about whether it was the landlord's decision or BBC Scotland's decision, Louise Thornton's response at 7 minutes 35, and I quote, "So it's our understanding that there isn't an option to renew the lease, that it's come to an end. And so when we were looking at all the options, this was not on the table." So can I ask you, why did the BBC tell the cast and the crew that the lease could not be renewed, when that was clearly not the case? And I've spoken to the landlord. And why did the BBC then seek to deliberately mislead the cast and the crew of River City?
So I'll start on that, because I don't recognise that characterisation at all. I think we've been pretty clear from a few moments ago that there is no viable option for the BBC to extend the lease at Dumbarton, particularly because of the presence of RAC on site. And you cannot expect the public broadcaster of Scotland to extend a lease in a premises where it doesn't...
Can I deal with that? Because I think that's an important point. RAC has been on site for more than a year. There's been nothing done. You've carried on production. It's actually an insignificant part of the site. The position is stable. This is a red herring. So and I would invite you to address the issue rather than hiding behind RAC.
I disagree with that. There's been a number of workarounds around RAC, including 3 inspections a day and temporary roofing put in place. But you cannot expect the BBC, as the public broadcaster, to renew a lease where there is defects. But the whole thing is a red herring. The timing of the lease is about when we end River City, not about the decision to end it.
Well,
and I think Louise was quite clear that the focus of where she'd made her decision was because the lease was ending at that point. She wasn't ending River City now. She was ending River City in a year's time when the lease ends. But that's for audience reasons.
And of course, you know, as I said at the very beginning, this is not an easy decision. We looked at all the options, including could we move out of the site because of the issues of rebuild and repair to somewhere else, either temporarily or on a permanent basis. We looked at everything. But the truth is, in the end, it was not value for money for the audience. And we don't have enough of an audience to make it value for money for the audience.
That's a different argument. And I would respect that argument if it had been advanced at the meeting on the 18th of March. Instead, cast and crew members were misled about the basis for the reasoning, and actually in the transcript the option to remain was not on the table at all. It just wasn't considered.
The option to remain was not an option we were considering because we weren't considering staying beyond the end of next year's series. But Louise, in her remarks, the bit you haven't quoted, was really, really clear that the prompt for the decision was the changing audience habits, which Hayley has walked us through over the last hour. We can't keep making something that not enough people are wanting to watch.
No, and indeed that is an argument that you could advance. But what I'm specifically addressing here is the fact that you misled cast and crew members. You know, the option to renew the lease was clearly available to you. You chose not to do so. There was diversionary tactics to blame the landlord. Just fess up to it.
Right,
just be honest with people.
I don't agree the option was there to renew the lease. The landlord may have wanted to renew the lease. That's different from whether the BBC had a viable option to renew it. But again, it's a smokescreen. And if people have discussed the landlord's intentions, I'm completely unsurprised by that. Because I was asked, as I said earlier in my evidence, 3 times, 3 weeks earlier than that, about the landlord's intentions. It was an open topic of discussion. Look, I'm a member of Equity. I fully understand how important it is to treat cast and crew with respect. I've been a member of the acting union for over 20 years. I'm not shy of making sure that we communicate with actors properly. I used to earn my living in a freelance capacity. I understand the fragility of working in that space. But I think the whole story was available to the cast, and I think it was expressed pretty clearly.
They think you misled them. They can't all have got it wrong. Thank you, Convener.
Mr Bibby, did you have a final question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, it wasn't just the fact that the cast and crew were misled at that meeting. There was no consultation with the union or the workers at River City prior to the decision being made. The press release went out at the same time there was a meeting. I think they've got every right to feel angry and betrayed, and they certainly feel angry and betrayed, and I don't think they're going to feel any less given the answers on those specific points this morning. It's not just the cast and crew that have got serious concerns about the ending of River City. We've also seen letters signed by the likes of Ewan McGregor, Brian Cox, Blythe Duff, Lorraine McIntosh, Richard E. Grant, Mervyn Welsh and hundreds of members of Scotland and the UK's cultural sector who are calling for the BBC to reconsider their decision to end River City, but particularly because of the impact it will have on training opportunities for the importance of the Scotland's film and TV industry going forward. My last question would be, in terms of that wealth of expertise and experience from the creative sector telling you to think again, do you think they're wrong, and will you reconsider given their representations?
Look, I respect that there are some, extremely experienced names on that list of people whose fundamental hope is to protect, Scottish production, Scottish drama sector, the training for Scottish talent, to give people the opportunities. I mean, some of them were worked on River City, some of them didn't, but to feel empathetic towards their colleagues who do, and to feel that they want to make their voice heard. What we are saying today is that we are absolutely going to grow that drama sector. We are going to continue those opportunities. We're going to grow the drama sector in Scotland. We're going to make content that we hope will get us big audiences and grow that representation and portrayal, not just across Scotland, but much broader. We're going to really work on the training opportunities to make sure that they are still there at all levels. But I'm afraid that the River City decision has been made and has been made on good grounds. And we will absolutely reinvest that money, and we're excited for the growth that we can make for Scotland and for Scotland's industry. And, I would hope that those people who are, absolutely have respect for their empathy and their commitment to the industry. I do too.
I don't just have respect for their empathy. I've a respect for their expertise and knowledge in the sector.
Absolutely,
as well.
but I had a conversation with somebody who worked on River City, who hadn't really heard that we were going to make the new things. They just knew about the cut. So once people hear that, hopefully today and in other ways that we can tell them, we have obviously launched all these programmes publicly, but that these 3 programmes are the start of something exciting. There is more to come. We are planning to advance and grow our industry in Scotland in the drama field and make really ambitious formats, really ambitious programmes that we hope will reach all of Scotland, much beyond, that will represent all of our stories. And I would hope that they would hear that and think that this was exciting, because I certainly think it is.
Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you. I think that exhausts questions this morning. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's a lot of interest in areas that we want to follow up in, particularly around the Charter commitment about Scottish Voices. So I'm sure you'll hear from us again soon. But that ends our session this morning. We do have another agenda item in private, so I'm really sorry if you could leave the room quickly, because we have to be finished in time for general questions at 12:30. Thank you very much.